All right. Hello and welcome everyone finally to the full Warframe roster review for 2025. This is of course a bit longer than a year since our last one, that being due to some delays caused by some massive reworks to 15 plus Warframes being all of the exalted changes that we got. But I don't think we're going to have a better point during this year to talk about where all the Warframes kind of currently sit. In general, I think things, if you want to just talk about the whole of where the Warframe balance is very good. I think we're probably in the best state Warframe has ever been balance-wise, but that doesn't mean there aren't Warframes that fall on the lower side of that balance. With that, I do want to talk about how I tier list, and for that, I do, of course, have another video that kind of goes into that more deeply, so we don't have to just draw it out forever and explain myself every single year. In general, though, just to give a small gist of this, basically, this is an effectiveness in totality tier list. This is not a which Warframes are my favorite tier list. It's not a which Warframes can kill enemies that are at level cap. This is this Warframe effective as like a first and foremost, like they don't die and they kill the enemies real good. And then in addition to that, how good are they at getting rewards that we care about and just doing other things of that nature easily. Easily is the important part of this tier list that I think matters a whole lot, because generally speaking, if you look at the usage stats that we get year over year, the easier to use Warframes are generally more used, and more used means that they're part of the meta in a stronger capacity. For that, though, that is of course not the only thing that matters. Difficult to use Warframes, as long as the rewards are there, are still highly valued. With that, I think we are pretty ready to get started. And of course, we are going to be going at this as we usually do in alphabetical order, starting with Ash once again, as we still don't have anything before him alphabetically, which is kind of surprising at this point. With that, though, Ash has, though he is a part of the big Exalted rework we got, not changed in grade. He is still sitting at a B+, but it is really worth noting that the B+ here is because he got the changes he got. He got a number of improvements kind of across his entire kit, with those primarily being Smokescreen being more easy to keep up, and Blade Storm being much more effective damage-wise and being specifically moddable, making him just colossally easier to use, especially for newer players, and he is generally a very accessible Warframe for new players, at least to get the build together on him. Actually, farming his parts may be a little on the difficult side, but that doesn't factor in here. Overall, though, his rework did not fix the kind of main issue that Ash usually gets to, which is that he's on the very slow side. Even with, being able to teleport to targets and all that, his Blade Storm, the mark and execute style of this, and the speed at which it is executed is just not really fast enough for most of the things you want to be doing. This is great when it works on like a VIP target that can actually take the amount of damage Ash is able to dish out, because you can use this in like Disruption, for example, very, very effectively. But it tends to be on the slow side, and invisibility with the kind of more enemies that we get that are doing damage just as an explosion, like for example, whenever they die or they just leave clouds of damage everywhere, is a little bit less effective than I maybe want it to be for his survivability. Couple that with Teleport and Shuriken seeing moderate benefit from the changes that he received, and it's mostly that he's able to do very, very large amounts of damage with Blade Storm and stay safe from the vast majority of things with Smokescreen, but his other two abilities aren't really helping him in the areas he would usually have trouble in. I really would have liked to see Shuriken be like an actual DPS ability that he can use on units that are not affected by Blade Storm, or just like being able to use this on a lot of weak enemies would have been a really cool space for him to kind of go into. But we didn't see that, but B+ ain't bad. Let's move on to Atlas. Now, Atlas is a Warframe that has benefited maybe the most from the Exalted rework. Atlas got extremely significant stat bumps to Landslide, and the direct modding of Landslide is colossal for any player that is new to the game and didn't have access to Incarnans, which were previously kind of holding Atlas up where he was. That being said, on the last roster review, I gave Atlas a B+, and even though Rumblers are functionally completely useless, being only okay without their augment, Petrify being a very solid crowd control ability that also has looting capabilities, which is important, and Tectonics being functionally useless in the vast majority of cases, though sometimes coming up to kind of mess with enemy AI in very rare cases. The thing Atlas is doing is having a good passive that can both heal him and not have him not be knocked down, because this doesn't list his other passive with his rubble. He can heal himself. He has a ton of armor. He doesn't get knocked down, and he punches you and everyone in your vicinity dies. And sometimes that's all it takes. The simplicity of what Atlas is bringing to the table is, I am going to uppercut you, and it's going to kill everyone you've ever known. And that is quite good. So I'm going to place Atlas at A. I will note, have him at A- for quite a bit of time, but the more I played after the changes for Atlas, the more it became readily apparent that when I was able to choose Atlas, he was very often the correct choice. Just being able to punch any given enemy for just 15 million damage and kill everybody else along the ride for functionally no energy in a lot of cases is just really, really good. The few things that this doesn't work on, you can usually just get away with the like kind of just general tankiness of Atlas and just health tanking through those scenarios. So he doesn't really have a whole lot of places where it comes up as a problem for him, and he's in a phenomenal state right now. But with that, we can move on over to Banshee, who's not doing so hot. Banshee, previously on our last tier list, was at C-, and she has continued to age poorly. That can unfortunately only mean that she's getting bumped down to D. We do have 3 D ranks this year, rounding out the 3 worst frames in the game, and Banshee is unfortunately among them. The big problems with Banshee is that basically Sonar is the only ability she has that is like of real use to her. This is a big damage boost on the enemies that it does function on, but on all of the enemies where the amount of damage that this adds would be good, Sonar either is extremely inconvenient or doesn't work at all, making this not really a damage buff whenever you would want it. Couple that with Sonic Boom with an augment, it can strip armor, though stripping armor is at an all-time low in terms of being a premium and fantastic ability, so Sonic Boom is also kind of a not ability. And then Soundquake being a standstill AoE that doesn't do even close to enough damage to wipe out anything that's on the steel path. On regular path, you can get away with it sometimes. This basically means that Silence is her good ability, and this is her really good ability. On other Warframes, subsuming a copy of Banshee and putting this on other Warframes is stellar, as this turns off all enemy abilities with their just like Xmas functions, all of like the Acolyte enemies, and any kind of enemy that has an ability that they use. Silence is like a Dungeons and Dragons style silence where they can't use any of that stuff. And if you're not Banshee, that's incredibly useful, but Banshee can't capitalize on this. This is a fantastic ability in a situation where you've solved a bunch of other stuff about your Warframe, like survivability and damage output, and then this is like the buffer that makes things extremely easy for you. But things are not extremely easy for Banshee. She is in a very rough state, and I really hope that she gets a rework soon, because I think there's a lot of potential just with her theme, and I don't think a lot would need to change about how Sonar functions in order for it to be just generically good in most content. But between her 4, which I don't think design-wise is kind of ever going to be good, and, you know, be healthy for the game, because the wub builds we've had in the past with her were just like a plague on the game until they got nerfed, and they got nerfed for a reason. But I really would like to see Banshee receive a rework at some point here, because it's getting tough out here, and there's not even really a huge amount of reason to bring her to Liches anymore. Thankfully, we get to brighten up and talk about Barook a bit here. Barook is a stellar Warframe. Now, Barook is one of the Warframes that were technically changed with the Exalted rework. However, Barook already did more damage than God himself, and did not need the damage bump that he could have received with the Exalted rework. The Exalted rework basically gave him all of the functions that he doesn't care that he got, because he was already so good. Now, already being so good is because his 3 is a massive amount of damage reduction, his 2 is like a huge AoE stun that charges him up real fast, and his 1, if you don't subsume over it, is just invincibility while you're not attacking, which is useful in a number of places and can charge you up if you're going into like level cap type scenarios, and is sometimes a good option there. But the main show is Serene Storm. You build up Serene Storm, you turn it on, and it just does tremendous damage. You just do waves of damage, you kill everybody. The slam attacks with this just do hilarious millions on millions of damage. And the only real problem with Baroo is that if you don't have an enemy count, you just become invincible, which is not so big of a downside. Desolate Hands has a tremendous amount of survivability that it gives you, and whenever that's coupled with Serene Storm, you're like really invincible. But whenever you don't have a lot of enemies around, it's really hard to build up your meter and keep it built up so you can keep using Serene Storm to kill everybody. But the downside of your kit being invincibility is not so bad, but the lower functionality that you have in situations where you don't have a bunch of enemies does mean that once again, Baroo is staying at A- this year, but a stellar Warframe that I love to see in the vast majority of content nonetheless. Absolutely fantastic. Moving on. We got to talk about Caliban. Now, I'm not going to mince words here. Caliban previously was at D rank, and he's not at D rank anymore, but I still did consider talking about Nautilus instead of him in this slot because Caliban is incredibly forgettable. Now, a really important note before we move on is that in the upcoming update, which is only a couple weeks away at this point, Caliban is getting a new augment, which might give him something more meaningful to do. God, I hope that that is the case. Currently, I am placing Caliban at a C rank, and I don't have a whole lot of hope that he is going to be much improved by that new augment, though I would love to see it. With that, the reason Caliban is at a C rank is that he did get a full rework, and the rework was better for him, but in general, it's kind of a bit of a mess. So, the big thing that Caliban got whenever they reworked him is that he now has Tau status, which he applies basically on every single one of his abilities, which makes enemies much more vulnerable to status procs. With that, though, he doesn't have any status procs that are inherent to his kit, which basically means if you're going to use that status that he inflicts, you need to then use weapons that inflict statuses in order to take advantage of that, but the weapons that inflict statuses already inflict the statuses. So it's at kind of a weird synergy point where you could just be buffing your damage, and that'll do the same thing as more statuses in a more generic and better way. And he does also have a damage buff, but otherwise things aren't really coming together with Tau status being used by him to make his abilities better, but you can weapons platform with him, which is not great because he doesn't have the other abilities for weapons platforming. His first ability is probably his overall best ability, which is you spinning through a bunch of enemies and getting a bunch of resources for your energy, your health, and your shields by spinning through those enemies. Really good for survivability, really fantastic for shield gating, and this is also the ability getting the augment that I hope is going to be the kind of cornerstone of a real build for Caliban to use for the foreseeable, but we'll have to see. So this ability is really solid. Great resourcing ability. We love to have a Warframe with a resourcing ability. His second ability is Sentient Wrath. This is much the same as it was, though it is a lot less finicky than it used to be. This lifts enemies up and makes them damage vulnerable, which is a nice multiplier for you to access. But this is really finicky to cast all the time. Its range isn't bad, and its duration isn't bad either. It's overall a totally fine ability, but in order to use this on large amounts of enemies, you have to spam it constantly. And spamming it constantly and applying it to every single group is just not really time effective for what you're trying to do. So while it is like a pretty reasonable damage buff, it's not so much where it's worth what you're putting into it the vast majority of the time. But it is like a solid enough ability overall, but kind of just on the middling side in the end. Speaking of the middling side, we have Lethal Progeny. Now, I do want to state that as a part of this rework, I think this ability is cool. It's just not good enough. This ability allows you to basically choose a summon, which is either Conculus, the Ortholist, or the Sumulist. Conculus, they're the melee guys. They come in, they melee guys. The Ortholist, they're the gun sentients. They come in, they shoot guys with guns. The Sumulist is like a defensive one that basically just generates a bunch of shields and summons a bunch of guys that generate shields, which is fine. The main problem is that the Conculus and the Ortholist are damage guys. And they don't do any fucking damage. They do no fucking damage. They get nothing done when they are around the vast majority of the time. Now, if you combine the full might of the Avengers of Warframe to damage buff them, and you have like a 25 form of build and the will of God on your side, yes, you can post a TikTok clip that shows that, oh man, the Ortholis killed a guy. But it sucks. It is so inconsistent, and it is just awful to like make use of in a mission ever. I wish they were good, and these are a part of the augment that he's going to get for his one that maybe will make the Ortholis halfway decent. But right now, all of these summons are basically glorified little shield generators, and woof, it is tough styles out here. These things do nothing. And speaking of doing nothing, Fusion Strike. Now, Fusion Strike in the past was basically a glorified just armor strip. Okay, stripping armor was really, really good. The armor strip changes made stripping armor still really good, but not the most important thing on this earth. That, combined with this not doing very much damage, means that you lock yourself down in place, you shoot a bunch of lasers. These lasers can be copied by your Conculus, and that means you're just shooting lasers that explode all over the place, right? The problem is that if you're on above regular path, even regular enemies like don't die when you do this. So this doesn't have any of like the factors that would like lead to you killing enemies with this. This doesn't like take advantage of the Tau procs that you can put on enemies and like put a bunch of heat on the enemies to then be multiplied by things like Archon Vitality and your strength modifier and the Tau status and like burn all the enemies down. Just like how like these guys don't have any statuses that they're really outputting to like capitalize on the other things you're doing. It just doesn't do much. So in totality, you are reasonably resourced and survivable with Razor Guyire, but then nothing then happens after that, which is really frustrating because I think from a fun perspective, I think that this kit is really cool. But using a really cool kit that then lets the enemy just walk up to you and kick you in the dick is not fantastic, and I wish the numbers in this thing were better. Anyway, let's move on and we can all forget about Caliban again. Speaking of calling the dead, let's talk about Chroma. Now, Chroma, previously, last year, I rated at a C+. And I am going to give him a C+ yet again. It is not the worst thing in the world to be Chroma. You've got a buff on your 2 of your choice, and you've got a big buff of Vex Armor that is honestly not aging particularly well. And then you've got a 4th ability, and you've got a 1. Now, what are you doing as Chroma, and why is he at C+? Well, in general, he's actually very similar to Caliban in terms of effectiveness, where like you have some like buffs and like okay survivability, and you can like get through missions well enough between your 2 and your 3. But Spectral Scream functionally doesn't do anything. You can change your element with this, which means you kind of gotta have it if you want to do that, though it's usually cuttable. And then you've got Effigy, which, let's be honest, is the reason for the plus here. This doubles credits. Chroma is the Warframe that you look at whenever you go, I need credits, and I would like to get twice the amount of credits that I would normally get. And in 2 specific scenarios, Chroma works for that, and he works extremely well for that. That being safe farming in 1999, which I would say is the single best credit farm, that is best done as Chroma. He makes it twice as good to be doing that in any scenario because he stacks with all of the boosters. That is stellar. There's basically no argument. You should be using Chroma for that farm, and it is an absolute staple of the game that I would suggest any player do, should you need credits specifically. Also, Profit Taker being the kind of potentially maybe higher amount of credits if you are extremely skilled at Profit Taker, that is also a place where Chroma works. Personally, I would say that you'd be better off not taking Chroma to Profit Taker and doing it as a Warframe that has like a way more easy and chill time with it, like Volt. But you can still bring Chroma to that if you want to get it done. That all being said, he works okay. He's got 2 buffs. If you just want to shoot guys and be like survivable enough, he does those things. And double credits is a pretty nice niche that it's really hard to get away from, as he's the guy to go to whenever you want to get twice the amount of credits. For that, though, we don't need to talk about Chroma anymore. We can move on to Catrine. And move on to Catrine we shall. Now, Catrine is actually in kind of a bit of an odd place currently. Now, previously, on her first roster review on the 2024, I did give her an A. That has proved over time to be just a little bit high, though that is due to some things kind of outside Catrine's control that have gotten a little bit worse about her. So we are bumping her down just to A-. I think that she's still very, very good. She's an excellent Warframe that can use her 1 as a DPS ability. Her 2 is a fantastic defensive ability for you and your entire squad. Prismatic Gem is actually like been a very good buff, and this is actually about to be even more useful with its new upcoming augment that we've seen. And Crystallize comes up in a number of different scenarios where some like high value targets can be eliminated very easily with this, usually that being acolytes and such. With that, she has a really solid supportive kit, and also her passive helps too, just giving just general health regen to the entire squad. And it's good stuff. It's just helpful. There's pretty much no scenario where Catrine is in a mission and she's having a bad time, and anytime there's a Catrine in the mission, all of your teammates are also having a fantastic time having her around. They're all just more survivable, they've got more status, and things are just easier with Catrine in the party. That being said, the reason we are bumping her down to A- is because her actual damage output capabilities have been hindered quite a bit by the changes made to armor. That is because her 1 used to really easily get through all of the armored units by always inflicting slash and then using that slash damage to easily kill those enemies by ignoring their armor value. Those enemies now have a significantly lower armor value, but significantly higher health, meaning that Fractured Blast has a much harder time keeping up and just like, wiping out squads of enemies like it could previously. So her damage taking a pretty significant hit, I think makes her like a bit less of a must-have type Warframe. So I have lowered her just a smidge, but she is still a phenomenal support to be bringing into a squad. Moving on, we get to talk about our first newcomer. That newcomer being Site 09. Now, I do want to talk about with Site 09 that there are kind of 2 very different builds for Site 09. One of them focuses on the thing that he's, I think, intended to do, which is neutralize his really good sniper rifle, the Neutralizer, and shooting enemies through infinite walls functionally and killing enemies where they spawn. That is coupled with evade, which gives you infinite invisibility as long as you can hit headshots, and resupply, which is a very, very good damage buff that gives you guaranteed status procs, which is also phenomenal. That is all kind of brought together by Seek, letting you see enemies through an incredible distance and giving you a massive amount of punch through. These things are an incredibly solid kit, and I think that Site is probably one of like the best designs that we have seen in Warframe in quite some time, which says a lot because the designs have been quite good. For that, I am putting Site at A-. Now, I would like to note, Site is not without issue, and this could be viewed as a bit high. There are a few reasons why he is an A-, because otherwise, I think I would be more comfortable talking about him at B+. He is an A- because Resupply has the capability to enable a zoom and boom type build, which basically gives you infinite energy, infinite ammo with guaranteed statuses on any number of abusable explosive weapons, a la the Kuva Tsar and such. Those builds, which function on Resupply, just giving you shield gating and infinite ammo by casting it constantly as you move through a mission, allow you to basically bullet jump through any mission as a moving explosion that kills everything. This allows you to clear missions incredibly quickly. Is it really high investment and a complete kind of bastardization of what Site wants to do with the entirety of his kit? Well, yeah, 100%, it totally is. But it's a really effective strategy, and for speedrunning a number of different missions like exterms, and like, mainly exterms, but like tracking relics doing that is kind of optimal. But those types of missions, or like even taking this through survivals because the damage is immense, or like really whatever you want to do, if you're willing to do that higher investment on the U part of it, because it is like a very particular thing that you're doing that is allo like a Titania, it is really effective. So having a very effective kind of speed running style build and a very effective just general build that can be a little on the slow side and a little on the not liking teammates side, because Evade does need you to get the headshots and not your teammates in order to give you more time invisible, which can sometimes come up as a problem. And he has like a few issues here and there with like, you don't really want to bring him to a boss fight in particular because there's not an enemy he can just kill over and over in a lot of those for his Evade to stay up. But I do want to put him at an A- because I do respect that the two different builds that he does have are very good, and they're very good in kind of completely opposite ways. With that, we can move on to Deghath. Now, Deghath, similarly actually to Catrine, has had a bit of a rough time. Rougher than most, I would say. Previously, on the last roster review, her first roster review, she was at a B+. But I have unfortunately had to move her down to a B-. Not a huge shift, but an important one, and one that has been caused by the armor changes. The armor changes were critical in the reduction to how good Deghath is, and that is because the previous thing that you used to do as Deghath is you would put Doom on enemies, then you would cast your 4. That would remove their armor, and then their little baby health that would remain under their armor would be killed by Rakali's cavalry. That was pretty good. That's a thing you could just kind of generally do, and her get out of jail free card of Grave Spirit was really effective. And the augment for Grave Spirit enabled a build where you can just turn Grave Spirit on and then spam horses, and then you didn't even have to do the Doom part of her kit. That's all well and good, but it's kind of much too slow now. With the enhanced health of enemies, generally speaking, it's just not that effective, and it's much more effective just to shoot a gun, and that's tough. But I do want to note that there is a new build that I will be posting after this review that actually utilizes her weird scythes as the DPS mechanism instead of her 4, and I found it to be better than the horses. That is notable because without it, I would have actually had her at C+, which is a really rough spot to be in, but that new build that we will be talking about in the future focuses on using weird scythes with a number of subsumes to basically spread Doom and be able to do damage at least a little bit more effectively and in a better amount of scenarios, and much more passively to allow you time to use weapons and not be stuck in the Rakali's cavalry animation all the time. So that's the thing that can come up here and is notable. Her survivability with Grave Spirit, I think, is generally pretty good. Just having a get out of jail free card where like, oh, you killed me, but no, you didn't, is pretty generally effective, and just needing to not die again for 25 seconds is usually very achievable. So from a survivability standpoint, she's decent, but that her output, which is what she really should be doing, like her 4 and everything else about like what her damage can do, should be better without subsumes, I think. But she's at least doing okay for now. Let's talk about Dante. Now, on the last roster review, he was at an A-, which was in lieu of him having just been nerfed, and me feeling that he might be a lower rank than I was really feeling about him, and that his part of his 4 was much worse, and all this stuff. With that, I'm happy to say that over the Exalted rework and just general performance of how Dante has done, I'm happy to bump him up to an A+. Dante has proven himself to be absolutely invaluable in pretty much any number of situations. He makes you and your entire team generally completely invulnerable when using Light Verse, where it's just spamming Overguard on yourself and the entire squad. The double Light Verse into Final Verse buff of Triumph, giving everyone a bunch of Overguard, and the ability to generate Overguard on kill is ridiculously good. Dark Verse can do pretty good in a number of different scenarios. It actually is okay for damage output when combined with his 4, though it is much more limited and not something you're going to use all the time anymore. And Dark Verse can break boxes, which is just kind of a nice thing in addition to it. The other combinations of Dark into Light and Light into Dark are just generally really good buffs for yourself and your squad, with the birds and the books that you can give the books to everybody and have the birds go around and make enemies more vulnerable. And that increased vulnerability only bolsters Noctua, which is now an absolutely stellar exalted weapon with the new exalted functionality that we just recently got, being just, an incredible sidearm that just kills everything in front of you. This, of course, needed to get the bug fix that it did get. If you do go watch my builds video for Dante, it's worth noting that the fix that I talk about in that video did happen, and that build is now absolutely ridiculously busted. So he's in a phenomenal state. Dante is incredible, and I do not see that changing. Let's talk Ember. Now, Ember has been incredibly popular for some reason over the last little bit, and she has seen quite a bit of play. That being said, in general, I think that Ember's performance has just been okay. On last year's review, I did have Ember at a B+, which was down from her even before then A ranking, and I'm sorry to report that this year I am moving her down just to a B. Now, this is not bad. As usual, we do have to clarify that B rank doesn't mean the Warframe is bad. That's not what that stands for. But I think that she is a bit worse than other Warframes that are in the B+ category this year, just by a smidge. She does, of course, have effective means of doing pretty much whatever she wants to do with the damage reduction she's going to get from Immolation, the armor strip from Fire Blast still being quite useful, and the ability to, if you want to, DPS with Inferno. Now, the if you want to is the kind of rough bit that is really bringing the party down for Ember. Inferno, I really think, deserves a buff to have better scaling damage into higher levels of play so that you can more readily use this as a higher level clear ability, because right now, you kinda don't have one. This ability can, if you cast it enough, kill enemies at higher levels, but it's much, much worse than actually using her 1 as your quote-unquote DPS ability, to use her augment just to buff your weapons with massive heat damage, and then just shoot the enemies. This makes her do kind of a poor imitation of the other weapons platform Warframes, and then you usually replace Inferno with something like Nourish or Roar or some such for massive damage buffing to make you just even more of a weapons platform. Does that build work, and is it really effective? Yes, absolutely. It is really very good. Is it Ember? I would argue not. I would really love to see Inferno be buffed, but she's by no means a poor Warframe. You can weapons platform and survive with her still quite well, but she's not doing anything particularly unique. So I think the right middle of just good is appropriate for her. Unfortunately, not right in the middle of just good, we have Equinox. Now, on last year's roster review, we put her at a C-, and yeah, she's going to stay there. She's not breaking down into the D ranks with a few others that we have there this year, but things are not currently phenomenal for Equinox. She is doing totally okay. She can still technically clear enemies with Maim, though it's a little on the fudgy side, with the damage output that you need on this falling off, and it just being kind of a weird one to need to build up, because you usually are using a very powerful weapon to kill a bunch of enemies, and then you kind of just get to cash it in to kill a bunch more enemies, but you could just keep shooting, generally speaking, with Maim. Maim trading is not a thing anymore, so there's not really any, a reason to do that. Her Pacify and Provoke just kind of doesn't have much of a reason to be used. Both forms of this are pretty bad, with the ability strength to nearby allies just not really being a thing that other Warframes want, and then reducing damage inflicted by nearby enemies being of course, a damage reduction for yourself as a tanking ability if you want to use it, but just generally being worse than other choices. Rest and Rage is still her, I would say, best ability, with the Night being the sleep here. This, of course, has a bunch of utility uses and is, of course, just great crowd control on the enemies that it does work on. This is also her Subsume, though, so if any other Warframe wants this, they have ready access to it. Her first ability is, of course, Metamorphosis. This is fine. With its augment, you can do a Wukong impression, which is... it's okay. It technically is okay. But overall, you can get a tanky build going with Mend plus Pacify, or you can just do Maim stuff to get a little bit more damage output. But overall, I think things are a little on the rough side for Equinox. I would really love to see her get looked at for some changes and general buffing, as I think she does have the potential to be an incredible support Warframe, but right now she's just kind of not living up to that. It's time to talk Excal. Now, Excal, obviously, is an Exalted Warframe. He's the first Exalted weapon Warframe with his Exalted Blade. It's why we call those weapons that. And he is, thankfully, tremendously improved by the Exalted rework. This, of course, being tremendously improved by the Exalted rework is important because otherwise I think I was going to have to lower the B+ that he got last year because things were not doing so hot for Excal. Thankfully, with the improvements of the rework giving you access to things like melee influence and just getting a tremendous amount of damage from that and being able to output a tremendous amount of damage while being invincible with slash dash, plus the improvements that were made to slash dash, I am comfortable bumping up not only Excal, as we're going to talk about a number of other Warframes, to A-. So this A- is basically that he is just truly on the lower end of A. It's not really that he has a particular, like, sticking issue, like Baroo, who has a very big problem with very low amounts of enemies just becoming invincible, so he kind of loses his kit. Excal never really loses anything. You're always able to slash dash around. You're always able to Exalted Blade with no problems. You can use Radial Javelin and its buffs and stuff. They usually replace this. You can stun enemies with Radial Howl very effectively. All these things, they always work, but they're a little bit less effective than the top echelons of like A+ territory. And just in terms of what you're able to output and kind of the safety at which you do it, I think it's at about an A- level. You're not going to be like performing insane stuff in any like particular niche or anything like that. He's just really good, which could definitely be worse. Let's move on. Speaking of could be worse, let's talk about Frost. Now, Frost has actually been quite a bit more useful than he's been in the past over this last year. We are bumping him up from the B that he got last year up to a B+. So if you want to view this as him stealing Embers plus, it kind of is that. And the main reason for that is because Frost has just been kind of a general workhorse that works at everything, and he's become a team support that's really nice to see in a lot of different pieces of content. Whenever you see a Frost in ETA or EDA or like really any content, usually right now what that comes alongside is a tremendous damage buff from Freeze Force, his 4 giving him and everyone else a bunch of overguard, and him defending any objectives you need to defend really effectively with Snow Globe. Now, his 2 is terrible. Ice Wave is really bad. This ability is awful, but that does give him room to subsume a number of useful abilities that you can kind of just go into whatever you want, as his stats are pretty malleable should you need to go into a particular one for any given subsume you want to run, whether that's like, Nourish or Gloom or what have you. And the flexibility and just general support to the squad has been really nice. I do think that Frost is probably one change to Ice Wave. Ice Wave, like, figuring out how Ice Wave could maybe be like a DPS ability is probably the missing piece, I think, to easily catapult Frost into A tier. But I do think that Frost is actually close to making it into A tier as it stands now. And one of his biggest problems is that if you don't have his Avalanche Augment, pretty much everything he wants to do falls apart, which is a tough sell. But as it stands currently, I'm very happy with where Frost is going. And maybe he'll be a 2 augment build that'll be stellar. Now, speaking of stellar, this hasn't changed much over the years. Let's just get it out of the way. Yeah, Gara's an A+. If you've been here before or you know what Gara does now, this is known. This is a known quantity. Gara is absolutely phenomenal. She was absolutely phenomenal, and she only got better with the Exalted rework. Now, prior, she would usually use her 4 plus her 1 plus her 2 in order to like make a big wall and break it with her 1 and do like DPS capabilities to like steal path and blow everybody up. But with the Exalted rework and the buffs that Shattered Lash got, now you just swipe right and just press 1 and everybody dies. And that is a significant improvement to the ease of use for Gara. You can just swipe on an enemy. Obviously, in the video, it's showing you using the piercing version, which you should never be using on Gara. But the swiping version of this just kills battalions of enemies at a time. You swipe it through a level, it goes through walls. It's just phenomenal. Using this alongside influence extends its range very significantly. I will say that without influence, it would be a lot like harder of a sell because influence makes it a bubble AoE instead of just being a line, which is very important to its usability in a number of tile sets. But Gara is just incredible. Her 2 gives her a bunch of defensive. You can give this to all of your allies. You can give this to defense targets that you're defending. You can couple that with her Mass Vitrify going around defensive targets, although this is hard to keep up around a defensive target if you are using Shattered Lash near it, as Shattered Lash will still blow this up, which is not such a problem because if you use your 1, all the enemies will be dead. And her only real problem is that Spectro Rage, it kind of doesn't do anything. Again, this is kind of just a free subsume slot that you can just make something else. Spectro Rage has never been a particularly amazing ability, especially without its augment. But the ease at which you can just be Gara and like do damage reduction, eat hot chip, and murder is obscene. She's a phenomenal Warframe that has only gotten better. Let's talk Garuda. Now, last year, and actually for every year that I believe Gara has been out, she's been a B ranker. That being said, I have decided this year that she is going to be bumped up to a B+. And this is just kind of for general usability. Her abilities have just gotten a bit better. The way that you deal damage with Dreadmere has gotten very much improved by the changes to armor. And you would think that Seeking Talons would get significantly worse with the changes to armor, with this being slash procs, but the raw damage of Dreadmere being considerably better, and Seeking Talons making everything you do deal slash is actually still incredibly effective. Just adding slash to any other already effective strategy is much more powerful whenever our normal effective strategies aren't already slash, which they used to be in the past. We used to just already be on slash, so making it so that we force proc it wasn't that much of a benefit. But now it is much more of a considerable addition to anything that you're outputting. Couple that with, of course, the new things that you can do with her that I showed off in her last builds video, with like her claws being a much more reasonable thing to be using in general, even though that, you know, doesn't need to come up a whole lot because there are plenty of fantastic melee weapons. And of course, her just, you know, infinite energy with bloodletting combined with the various arcanes you can utilize it with means that you're usually invincible. You usually have infinite energy, and there's not really much the enemies can do about it, as you're going to be constantly shield gating everything that they're doing. Blood Altar is the weak point of this kit. Again, this is usually just replaced with something else through the subsume system, but even as like a standalone ability, it's really not so bad on its own, as it is like a heal and like a stun for one enemy, which is just fine. And in the subsume system, this actually has, or has had, some uses on other Warframes in the past. Overall, I think that Garuda is just like a bit better just due to like kind of the situational nature of it, kind of the opposite of what happened with Catrine. We've talked a lot about the kind of cause and effect of the changes to armor on a number of different Warframes. But you know who doesn't give a shit about that at all? Goss. Goss has been, over every single year I've given him a grade, an A- Warframe. And that hasn't changed at all. He still gives tremendous buffs, can DPS with Thermal Sunder should he need to, and has very solid survivability with kinetic plating, and is very fast to get around with Mach Rush, with the main detractor from his entire kit as a whole being that, similarly to Baroo, though differently, if you're not constantly moving around and zipping around all over the place and the game mode doesn't want you to be doing that, his meter management is like a huge pain. So he gets a little bit of a detractor because of that. If you are doing a mission that is well suited to Goss, though, he performs incredibly well with just, you know, tremendous weapon buffing. If you just want to like DPS with Thermal Sunder, this just wipes out whole squads of enemies as long as you're in redline very easily, with its like ridiculous scaling that it gets access to that honestly Ember should probably have. And of course, being functionally completely invincible to all of the common damage types is pretty big. I will note that he is getting a little bit of an extra negative as compared to someone like Baroo, because he is vulnerable to certain damage types, and those damage types have become a little bit more common with the addition of the 1999 content. But Goss is really not currently having any troubles. He's just speeding around, just, you know, playing pranks on the enemies while he kills everybody. Now, Goss's buddy Grenle, on the other hand, has received a number of different changes. This primarily being that Regurgitate with its new augment is actually quite an effective damage output solution where you eat a bunch of enemies and then spit them out and create a bunch of very high damage gas clouds that works at pretty much all levels of play. This is really solid, a great thing to be doing. It strips armor, which is just kind of a bonus for its damage output, and makes it so that like the eat and then spit out game plan actually works, which in the past you pretty much would never use Regurgitate because it didn't have enough of a payoff, but the augment really gets him there. That being said, there are enough like hitches and weirdness to his current gameplay that unfortunately, though he is one of my favorite Warframes, I do have to keep him at a B+. He is just a bit worse than his speedy brother, and this is for a number of different reasons. These mostly relate to him not being able to keep himself full really any content. Whenever you eat enemies, they will die pretty quickly in your stomach, meaning that you lose all of the benefits for pulverize and for like your additional armor and such like that very, very quickly. I think that it would be as simple as once you like have a full belly, if you like maintained that state for some amount of time and just needed to like get a full belly every so often in order to maintain those buffs, that he would be much better in a larger variety of content. But right now he's kind of held back by, at most levels of play, eating enemies can be a difficulty because of course you can't eat enemies with overguard, and your teammates will be killing a lot of weaker style enemies, so you're not going to have much to feast on if you're playing in team content. That is just kind of the problems that follow Grenle around. Is he good? Yeah, he's very tanky. He can shield gate really well. His low shields actually give him a significant benefit in that scenario. And his damage output is pretty solid when you can get going with Regurgitate, and he can be quite fast as well with Pulverize, and Pulverize breaking boxes is not nothing to be considered. So overall, I think Grenle's in a pretty good spot, but the few problems around his kit just kind of compound to bring him down a peg, or keep him down a peg as he's still at B+. Let's talk about Guyire. And I know this conversation is not going to make many people happy. Now, Guyire previously was at a B-, and she is moving down. She is moving down to C+. This is for a variety of reasons. Guyire is an incredibly greedy design that really often does not play well with others, with her abilities going on cooldown whenever she is not able to get kills with her abilities. And that compounds with getting kills with her abilities being much less effective than a lot of other Warframes. It is just considerably slower for her to be using either Arc Sphere or Coil Horizon in conjunction with her 4 and her 3 to get enemies dead. Does it get enemies dead? Yeah. But it does so at like an okay-ish pace. And an okay-ish pace of killing enemies can be good. But that okay-ish pace is coupled with some of the worst survivability in the game and multiple augments that I would call pretty much must use if you're using some of her abilities. The one for her Cathode Grace to keep going constantly really makes it so that you can build her more greedy, which she needs. Like, she needs to be more greedy in order to get her payoffs going. But that removes a slot from your build. If you want to use her Coil Horizon augment, which allows it to do some more interesting DPS and be used a little bit more effectively in that regard, that's another augment in her build, which is constantly just breaking down her needing every stat and not being able to get them. Would she love to be able to include like redirection for some survivability and adaptation? Yeah, probably. But she just doesn't really have room if you also want the enemies to die. It's not a situation where like Saren, for example, just kind of does whatever with whatever stats. You really need to hit certain strength thresholds to be killing enemies fast enough to support what you're doing at the incredibly low survivability you have to do it at. And I think that Guyire's really, really fun, but the effectiveness is just tough. I would really love to see just some general buffs for what Guyire is up to, because I think from a numbers standpoint, if she just did more damage, she'd have more room in her build to make her life a little bit easier, which would go over well for her, I think. But yeah, moving on. I know a lot of people are going to be unhappy about that one. Let's talk about Harrow. Now, Harrow, in our last review, was at a B+, and this year I'm moving him down just a smidge to B. I think that Harrow is kind of like the pinnacle of the perfectly average-ish Warframe, especially in a more supporting type role. For that, his supporting type role doesn't offer a whole lot right now. He can kick out a ton of energy to the squad with Thurible, and you can make everyone temporarily invincible with Covenant, and those two things are not nothing, but they're really not the support stuff that we want to generally be seeing from our current supports, where a lot of the supporting type Warframes are offering functionally completely invincible allies all the time. The kind of hitchiness of Covenant is not really desired, and the crit buffs of this, while acceptable, are not really helping us in most situations. Thurible, on the other hand, because most Warframes are built to sustain themselves, there's not really a situation where we need this insane amount of energy generation that you can do, and this energy generation means that you need to be doing it. It's not a buff that you can apply to your teammates and then they can get themselves their own energy through their headshots and kills. You need to be getting those kills. So because of that, you need to be doing kind of a lot in the mission. And that means that the more you are doing, you're supporting teammates who are doing less. And if your teammates are doing as much as you'd expect them to be doing, like a Mesa or something, you're not really helping them in the vast majority of cases, which is kind of a weird place to be. You couple that with Penance being fine, like the reload speed and the fire rate are okay. And of course, Condemn being maybe your best ability, with the ability to generate a tremendous amount of shields and lock down a ton of enemies, this being an amazing subsume for other Warframes. And you get a playstyle that is just generally good. It can be converted into like a Thermal Sunder damage dealer that does work on Steel Path, like reasonably enough. And you get like an okay experience at pretty much anything you want to take him to. Does he like work pretty much everywhere? Yeah. Does he work in like kind of a weird way that's a little bit less than you maybe exactly desire in all those places? Yeah. But, you know, sometimes you want to eat a perfectly average priest-shaped meal, and I guess that's him. Now, discussing something perfectly average is not something we're going to be discussing in regards to Hildren. Now, Hildren previously received an A- from me, and there was some concern that she was going to go down in grade. Because of the changes to like the scaling of armor and all that stuff, there were some questions to be asked about what the future of Hildren stuff was going to be whenever she was just spamming pillage and then like having Haven up and having, you know, burning pillage be her whole thing. Thankfully, everything about the way that we use Hildren has changed. Luckily for her, it's changed in a pretty good way and has kept her at a solid A-. Her new functionality is that her augment lets her use her Balefire in her 4. Yes, we are using her 4 in a unique alt fire that basically lets you just barrage fire huge explosions and kill everybody in front of you constantly. That's pretty good. The buffs to Aegis Storm mean that it's actually quite fast at dodging around, and it provides its crowd control very well, and it's quite large AoE. And you still get all of the benefits of just dumping pillage out and removing all of the armor and all of the shields of all the enemies around you. There are still the like notable disadvantages of Hildren, which is that if the enemies you're fighting don't have armor or shields, your energy, for lack of a better term, because you use your shields as energy, economy gets a whole lot worse very suddenly. But subsumes, like Harrow's subsume actually, really fix that problem up and let her just kind of do what she's doing in pretty much any scenario. So she now has like a really solid explosive exalted weapon. She's pretty much invincible in the vast majority of content with her very large amounts of shield and constant regeneration that you're going to usually be on, especially when coupled alongside things like Aegis. And she's just having a phenomenal time at pretty much anything that is not getting into like, mid-high 4-digit levels, where suddenly enemies are going to be shooting you once for your entire energy pool, which suddenly becomes a big problem. Though even that has been bolstered by the secondary arcanes letting you steal Overguard and being able to protect your energy economy, your shield, through that method. So things are looking pretty bright for Hildren. I would say in terms of like the usability of her kit, it's really never been better. All right, Hydroid. Now, Hydroid obviously received a big rework, and we placed Hydroid at an A last time. With that, unfortunately, very extremely similar to how Catrine changed, Hydroid is moving down to an A-. This really does mostly have to do with Tempest Barrage being a much less effective means of damage output now, with the much higher health values that the enemies that we're fighting generally have, because they have much lower armor values, and the armor stripping that you can do as Hydroid is worse. That is kind of exactly to be expected, and it's not that this is a bad performing strategy. It still works very well, and like the plunder plus your one, and, like throwing out your tentacle swarms to also get like some loot and crowd control, all still works as like a good package. You're still plenty survivable. You still do plenty of damage. You have good weapon buffing. Generally, Title Surge is more of like a free subsume slot, but just in general, you can just spam out Tempest Barrages, use Plunder, and like throw out Tentacle Swarm pretty like regularly, and that's just gonna do stuff in any given mission. Tempest Barrage is even still a considered subsume for other Warframes as a damage dealing ability that you can put on other frames, so it can't be doing too bad. But yeah, a little bit worse on Hydroid. This is really for a lot of the reasons that I've been talking about with Catrine and all that. And it just is the way that it is. Maybe a slight damage buff across some of these abilities that really relied on their ability to armor strip would have been cool whenever they made that armor change, but of course, a little bit of time needs to pass to really see how those things met out. Inaros. So, Inaros has been kind of a history of ups and downs. He's been an A, he's been in B, he's been a high B, he's been a low B, and unfortunately, I would like to talk about him being at currently B-. Now, previously, he was able to do quite a lot by inflicting a bunch of statuses, by using his second ability, Sandstorm, to deal a bunch of damage with its augment and really just like get at enemies that way with a bunch of splash damage. Now, as we've talked about, the armor changes and the health increases kind of across the board have made things a bit tougher for Inaros overall. Combine that with the rising levels of the game means that as a health-only Warframe, he's more vulnerable than he's ever been in the past. Because when enemies are just regularly level 500 plus now, he can just die in some of that harder content where other like Warframes will just kind of get a free pass with their shields and general survivability. That makes things tough, because whenever you get to 0 shields, you do have time to respond, and whenever you get to 0 health, you die, which is rough. You combine that with Sandstorm, which he was using as a DPS ability, being a considerably worse DPS ability now, and his one not doing a whole lot besides stunning still, and Scarab Shell being fine as a survivability method, and of course it is going to eat those status effects, which is good. And Scarab Swarm not doing what you want it to do anymore. Of course, like we talked about, the armor strips are much worse now, so those like guaranteed corrosive statuses and like all that such is not, it's just not really coming together. There's not like enough damage. The survivability is like, health tanking is kind of not in a fantastic spot right now, and his damage being lowered from where it was, which was bumping him up to like a B+ in terms of his just general ability to clear. That becoming worse again has put him right back down to where he was previously, back down at B-. Unfortunate to be sure, but I do think that like with his current kit, just some like general number buffs, or of course, just systematic changes to how health tanking currently works, could easily bump him back up. Time to talk Ivara. Now, Ivara, interestingly, has moved down just a smidge from a B+ just down to a B. I want to talk about why. The reason for this is she is very useful for a large variety of niche tasks, such as hunting, being a lot of people's go-to spy mission runner, and just being just like generally pretty good and pretty like casual friendly to just kind of everything. You turn on Prowl and you just kind of do stuff. But the Exalted rework kind of revealed a problem that Ivara has, and that is that Artemis Bow is really just not aging very well. Even with its augment, this is just not performing super well. It is like primarily pretty much single target outside of enemies who are standing in a line for the most part, and it's just not keeping up with all of the other exalted weapons or just weapons in general that we usually want to be on. That doesn't mean that it's useless. It does good damage, but the way that it applies that damage is just not at the effectiveness level that you usually want to see. The way that I've been talking about this on stream and whenever I play Ivara is that, weirdly, even though it's not a bad weapon, this is kind of the big loser of the Exalted Weapons update, because it just revealed that even with all of like these changes and additions, it even still pales in comparison to other much better primaries that you could have access to, which is a pretty tough spot to be in. Now, there are cool things you can do with Ivara, mostly revolving around like some interesting strategies you can apply with Navigator, like with the book and such like that are reasonably effective like ways to go about general mission running that you can do. And of course, Quiver is still like, you know, invisibility, and you can do certain things with like scanning missions and such, and dash wire buffing and some such things that you can do there that are all pretty decent. And you can choose to use your invisibility this way, though I would tend to avoid it. But the general package of what Ivara has going for her is that if you like using her for the convenience of what she brings to certain activities, such as fishing as well, for example, she is stellar at all of that stuff. But I would say that if she didn't have all of those different niches that she can fill and really be like a workhorse for your arsenal, she would be at like even a bit lower than this rating. Probably she would get bumped down to like a B- without all of those nice additional things that she can benefit you from. We got another new Warframe to talk about, though. Let's talk about Jade. Jade is brand new for this roster review, and she is absolutely stellar. I've had a fantastic time with Jade, very similarly to Sight. I think that her design is incredibly good. And in terms of her just general effectiveness, I am putting her at an A. Now, it's worth noting that in like the next week or so, we are getting another new augment for her. I don't predict that that augment is going to be world changing for her in terms of being like a huge buff, and I'm not sure she's even really going to be able to make room for it. But already the general game plan of what Jade is up to is really nice. She's kind of a somewhat support, somewhat DPS style Warframe, where she will go into her glory on high, letting her fly around, just getting true flight and doing whatever she wants, and giving her an exalted weapon to use with her kind of like beams of light that she'll be firing. And she has Ophanim Eyes, which is a slow at all enemies that she's looking at, and an armor strip on all enemies that she's looking at, and this can revive allies, though that is a minor benefit. So she's got right away a 4 to utilize. It is an exalted weapon that is very solid in terms of its damage output, kicking out a massive amount of heat procs, and that's combined with all the enemies that you are looking at and shooting with that, getting an armor strip and a slow, meaning that there's not really much the enemies can do about it whenever you're looking at them. And then you combine that with Symphony of Mercy, which is a slew of different buffs. You have Power of the Seven, which is a large strength buff, which you can use to turn that on, and then turn your other abilities on, and then swap to your second buff, which is Deathbringer, which is a Serration-style damage increase for yourself and your entire squad, which is a nice effective damage buff. And then finally, her defensive buff, which is Spirit of Resilience, basically just giving all of your allies a bunch of shields, which in most cases will make everybody pretty much invincible. That's all really good. But that's not where it ends, because we also get Light's Judgment. Light's Judgment lets you throw out an orb that basically starts affecting an area. And if you utilize that with your alt fire, enemies that stand in your 1 get marked, though they can be marked by your 4 as well. That's usually not what you're going to be doing. You throw out your 1, the enemies get marked. You alt fire with your 4, and everybody blows up. This can use an immense amount of energy sometimes, but generally speaking, this is just like a really good way to clear large groups of enemies, especially whenever they're huddled together. And And it really just gives her like a nice varietal kit that only really has problems whenever you need to carry like a mobile defense, like terminal key. Those are like pretty much the only trouble you're going to run into because you can't carry those around while you're in Glory on high. And obviously the list of like negative things about her is pretty damn low. So she's an incredibly good Warframe that just like zaps everybody, slows everybody, strips all the armor off enemies, buffs the squad, buffs herself, blows everybody up when necessary, and provides heals and shields and all that good business while she's at it. I will note that her survivability is generally pretty highly tied, I would find, or I have found, to effects like the aviator mods and the aerodynamic mods that give her damage reduction while she's flying around. But that stuff easily fits into her build because she gets double aura slots. So it's really not been difficult to find room for all of that. And it just in general, because of those double aura slots, she's also very easy to build on a budget. So if you're a newer player, getting her is quite effective for your build in and then effectiveness out, I would say. But yeah, that's Jade. Absolutely stellar. Happy to add her to the roster. I'll be honest. We're going to talk about Cora. And Cora's been good for a couple of years here. And the Exalted changes only kept her insanely good. She's still at A+. We're going to have a very similar conversation here as we had with Gara. But we have a few other things to talk about. First and foremost, Whipclaw. Now, with the Exalted changes and her not getting access to like the Magistar and Karnan buffs and so on and so forth, do you technically do less damage with Whipclaw now? That actually depends on how you calculate the math. Will you see a lower number when you hit one guy? Yes. Will that guy be dead? Almost always. So does the lower number matter? Pretty much never is the answer. And generally speaking, you're on an influence build, and the thing that influence does is scales with group size and also scales your range out to hit more enemies than you'd normally be able to. So does Cora do more damage effectively to more enemies? I would tend to say yes, at least in the vast majority of meaningful content, and even in like lesser content, the enemies are dying instantly, so there's really no functional difference from how she worked before. So personally, for me, there hasn't been any functional change to Whipclaw besides now it procs influence and kills everybody 25 additional meters away, which I think is pretty good personally. Of course, she does have Ensnare. This is very useful for missions like Disruption, and just it's a general stun that works on way more things than you'd think it would. And of course, increases the damage of Whipclaw should you need to do so for some reason. That is, of course, also combined with Strangledome. Strangledome being the premier looting option with its augment. This is the best way to farm just about anything that drops off of an enemy, as long as they can be picked up by your 4 or just like even generally interacted with by your 4. This is a tremendously useful ability for the reason of also any enemy that you hit in it with your 1 will hit every other enemy inside of it as well, allowing for you to do even more damage to those enemies while they are inside of it. Just, scaling it to ridiculous. And finally, we get to talk about Venari. Now, Venari, I think, is the underrated part of Cora's kit, because quietly, the changes have allowed Venari to be a little murder monster. With the proper build on Venari, you won't be looking in the direction that Venari is. But every enemy near Venari will be dying pretty much constantly. Venari will just run up to a pack of enemies, do basically Light's Judgment attack to one guy, and then with the proper build, allowing you to do Contamination just to kill everybody that is around that one guy. What this functionally means is that Venari is doing a lot that you're not seeing, and bonus, this is a free subsume slot. What I mean by free is that you don't really care about swapping Venari to different modes, and you don't lose Venari whenever you subsume over this slot, meaning you not only get to keep the murder cat, you also get whatever subsume you want completely for free. And it's just all tremendously good. The one downside to being Cora is that your survivability is pretty much exclusively shield gating. But if you're not casting Whipclaw, you probably should be casting Whipclaw. So it's not really that big of an ask for Korra to be on a shield gating type build. It just means you need to include a couple of those mods, and then you're pretty much invincible all of the time. So absolutely stellar Warframe probably didn't need to spend this much time just, gushing about how incredible Korra is. Though maybe it will serve as a point of comparison. We have another newcomer, that being Kome. Now, based on the way people talk about how I talked about Kome, I think a lot of people are probably expecting me to give this Warframe like an F, but I assure you, it's really not that dire. I've got Kome at just a B-, just a bit below average, a bit below what I would like to see for her. And what I would like to see for her is the point of the negativity I have surrounding this Warframe. I think her design is really cool. I think her kit is really cool. I think the effectiveness of what she outputs could be a whole lot better. That basically revolves around her 1 and her 4. So her Bunraku is basically puppet strings that you put out. These do a bunch of status based on her dice rolls. And the damage that this outputs is nil. This is really rough without another ability to back it up, which is usually the unique helmet subsume that makes all the statuses stack up a bunch. I forget its name currently, but that's usually the thing that you're using, and you use it instead of Kumhimo. Kumhimo, this is a bunch of strings that you throw out, and you can do some like hitchy things where you drag enemies through this with like Zephyr subsume, but that is like mega copium and not worth it. This ability also really just does not do close to enough damage and doesn't scale particularly well, which is really tough. So her 2 damage output potential abilities, Bunraku and Kumihimo, just really don't get you where you want to go, meaning that you kind of get reduced down to forcing Bunraku to work, which is what I personally like to do, or mostly just surviving off of Omamori, which does have some RNG associated with it, but honestly, I find it not to be too particularly difficult to survive with this. You can actually like do like some health tanking and like some shield gating kind of combined on her to make surviving pretty reasonable, while you do Omikuji. Now, Omikuji did get an augment that made it a whole lot more palatable to use. So that augment is a tremendous build around, and I still think there are fundamental problems with this ability in that a lot of the decrees just aren't a reward whenever you do the challenges it gives you. It'll give you a challenge that's like kill 20 guys while sliding, and then you will get the decree, and it will be like hitch a bus to Tennessee, and then while you're there, you run 10% faster. And it's just, there's so many decrees that are just not good. I really would love to see, as I've said in the past, the whole Kome video is basically talking about the way in which this should be more like the actual Duviri decrees, getting more choice with this, getting the generalized buffs you get while in Duviri with this. All of those types of things could really improve this and make it a whole lot better. Right now, it's like kind of an interesting thing you can do on longer missions, and it's like, an interesting playstyle to be sure, but I think the general effectiveness of Kome is just lower than I want it to be. It's not that she can't do things. She can do stuff. Her survivability is all right, and her damage output can be made to work with Bunraku. But for me personally, it's a thing of, I think her design is incredible, and like her theme is super fun and cool, and she comes out as just kind of a disappointing for me personally in terms of her actual performance. Okay, let's talk about Kullervo. This one actually probably also is going to be a bit of a controversial one, even though this rating is still extremely high. Kullervo, previously, I had at an A+, and I have decided to move that down just a smidge, down to just an A. This is for kind of a number of different reasons, but the really primary reason is the rising level of enemies in like us getting like ETA and EDA style content, and I assume more of that stuff being on the way, as there's really no sign of DE slowing down on that type of stuff. Being a shieldless Warframe is not so great right now, and that is the primary thing bringing Kullervo down. The reason is because whenever you get to those higher levels, recompense basically becomes a thing that you are hitting every single time it's available. And that like drain on your energy economy can really be a tough thing in those scenarios. Can Kullervo absolutely get away with it pretty much 100% of the time? Yes. Between Collective Curse, tying all the enemies together, the massive buffs and mobility you get from Wrathful Advance, and of course Storm of Ukko just being generally useful in a variety of different scenarios, whether that is like damage output, especially at like medium to low levels, or of course being combined with Collective Curse in order to DPS that way, or of course just like being used to build up your combo if you're just using it for that, and having this follow you in certain game modes with its augment. All of that stuff, his actual output of damage and his general survivability is still very good, but I have decided just to bump him down just a little bit, down to just A instead of way up in like the A plus category, as I feel like there's just a couple of spots where it gets a little bit harder for him than I would really like it to. Obviously, he's still at A, so it's not that much harder for him than it could be. But being a like health tank Warframe underneath the Overguard is a really big downside, because all of the other Warframes that are dealing with Overguard pretty much have a shield to fall back on, meaning they get to double gate, and the difference between getting a single gate and a double gate is pretty huge, and offers up some like big design differences. If he had 200 shields, I think he would easily be a no problem, trivial A plus for me. And it might still be the case that I'm being overly harsh on him, even putting him down to A, because Kullervo is a phenomenal Warframe. Okay, let's talk Lavos. Lavos got his prime, and previously, I had Lavos at a C+. Thankfully, Lavos is being bumped up to a B-. Not much of a bump, but still definitely a bump up. Unfortunately, this doesn't have a tremendous amount to do with his kit being better, and more so has to do with his elemental augment that just allows him to choose any element in the game and just slap it on to every single form of his damage dealing, alongside being reasonably tanky enough to get away with it. That basically means that he is a weapons platform for, lack of anything else to really do. And I still do think that in general, his kit, Ophidian Bite, Vile Rush, Transmutation Probe, and Catalyze, all 4 of these abilities, I think should have better numbers and be more effective at what they do, and potentially have like some cooldown changes, or maybe some like, just functionality changes to what Lavos's like core loop is, to make it feel more worth it to do. It's just a matter of like the effectiveness of using his abilities is worse than installing his augment and just like slapping Ophidian Bite to get this gigantic damage buff and then just shooting guys. And just completely foregoing using any of his stuff outside of giving yourself the particular elemental buff you want, being the better way to go. Basically means that you're just like cosplaying as Lavos while just shooting gun decently. And I think that is a tough spot to be in. But it is better than what he was doing before, which was only relying on his quite lackluster numbered abilities. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You all know what it is. This is another D-rank Warframe. This is Limbo. And that's like kind of the beginning and the end of what we need to talk about, honestly. The Rift is a design problem. This is just not like a good thing to like have, because anytime this Warframe can be considered good, it is a like acrid toxin on the thing that it can affect, and most routinely showcases the design problem with the thing that it's good at, instead of just being something for Limbo to be good at. Obviously, the most recent thing we have to show for that is Scarlet Spear, whenever the thing you would do with Limbo is turn on Cataclysm, and then you turn on Stasis, and then you would go make a coffee and just completely negate the entire game type. That, of course, is a problem with that game type, but the fact that that's what Limbo is good at is also a problem. If in any case the thing that you're good at is like separating the worlds and then stopping time and then no longer playing, that is bad for the game's design. In addition to that, he is just annoying for other players with his like, Cataclysm, dividing things between the Rift and not. Some Warframes are of course unaffected by that. But just in general, it's just a rather annoying thing for teammates to deal with that is also not particularly effective. This strategy is ruined completely by the enemy Eximus being able to go through the rift and just hit you anyway with their abilities, which you will often die from. And of course, any kind of nullification happening to you pretty much will just kill you on the spot. Banish, not a particularly effective thing to do unless you're playing like Deception, which none of us are, because that game mode has nothing for rewards and no one wants to play it. And Rift Surge is like a potentially, you know, decent. It's bad. It's a bad damage buff. Even it's like super awkward to like put like on enemies, and like the damage buff is just like not worth it whenever you could just shoot the enemy that's already stasised in time anyway. And it's just a rough sell all the way around. It's bad news. If you wanted to argue with me about which one of the D rank Warframes is the worst, I think I have a strong argument for it definitely being Limbo. I think that there are ways to rework him to keep him like similarly themed. But honestly, my opinion is that the Rift itself has to go because it's like a horrific design problem. That, of course, I wouldn't blame DE for because this Warframe's ancient and it was really cool and interesting whenever they put it out at the time. Now, if our B rankers embody a perfectly average Warframe, Loki embodies a perfectly below average Warframe, remaining at C rank. This is just fine. This mostly is in regard to just I go invisible, and in a lot of cases, that's good enough. Loki is fast and invisible, and that's you can do that. You can also do a Revenant impression by using Switch Teleport with its augment and like getting invincibility that way. I would not ever play him that way, but you could. Radial Disarm used to be good back in like, you know, like the 2015 style era. That was 10 years ago, by the way. Yeah, it's, you know, there's stuff here. His new augment for Decoy is like kind of cute, like kind of adorable, kind of like, you know, that's neat that he can apply the statuses through that. But in general, like, you're invisible, you're pretty fast, and that's going to be good enough for the, like, you know, vast majority of missions you're going to do. But it's just not a whole lot. Lucky us, now we get to talk about another starter. This is Mag, who is similarly to Excal also being bumped up from B all the way up to A-. Mag is in actually kind of a great state right now. Just where Mag has gotten to with like using Magnetize with Breach Surge alongside like Pull being so amazing in the early game and really not being bad later. Polarize is her kind of like not great ability, but Crush being able to give yourself, you know, instant shield refills and like full armor strips for its still quite good damage bonus, really has done Mag pretty well. I will say that the reason that she is at A- is mainly because Magnetize is a bit of a weird one sometimes. You can pretty much get through any scenario by just like, you know, crushing like her shields back on or using Polarize to put her shields back on and just like have a huge amount of survivability that way. But Magnetize doesn't work on a number of different enemies, and in certain environments or certain weird placements, it can really be a pain to get going. What Magnetize really wants is like large open areas where it can like explode and really kill a lot of enemies, especially whenever you're combining it with the Breach Surge synergies. But in some scenarios, you just like kind of aren't going to get that. But that is like a pretty minor detractor overall. And I would say the biggest negative is that I think that for higher level play, you'll notice that I do continue to mention Breach Surge. I do think that Breach Surge is a thing that is bringing her up with its unique interactions with her too. And if you had to use like the usual interactions with Magnetize, I do think this would probably bump her back down into B rank. But it is also worth noting that Mag is, I would say, the best starter pretty easily. That is mostly on the back of Pull being absolutely insanely good, but the shield restoring effects are also quite powerful. So if you're looking specifically at her as a starter, I think she is extremely, extremely good for that, and she is my preferred starter. You know, it's pretty obvious when we get to the obvious ones. Very much like, you know, Gara and very much like Korra. Yeah, guess what, everybody? Mesa is an A+. Mesa is like, you know, just the staple. She's just incredible at everything, pretty much. Shatter Shield makes her pretty much invincible to most forms of offense from the enemies. Shooting Gallery is a nice little buff for her, giving you a little bit of extra damage and stunning enemies around you. And then, of course, the main attractor is Peacemaker. Just tremendous damage in a very, like, large radius. Of course, that shrinks as you continue shooting, but as it shrinks, your damage just goes up, meaning that any targets that this works on, that it can be used on, will die very, very quickly. This scales really easily into Steel Path. That's only been made better by the different tools that we get access to, such as, like, new arcanes like Hotshot and stuff, really adding even more to this. And the only real negative I can say about her is that Ballistic Battery is pretty much just totally useless, but you just replace this with Nourish or whatever else, and she's having an absolutely amazing time with an even stronger set of Peacemakers. She's incredible at, like, pretty much everything, with very limited things that she, like, can't do. Even if you don't get to use your Peacemakers on an enemy, like, just Shatter Shield plus Shooting Gallery is usually more than enough to get you wherever you need to go. I have similar feelings on Mirage. Mirage, since her changes, with Eclipse being now very consistently the damage reduction or the damage increase, has a tremendous amount of consistency and just good things to do. You can throw a Prism. This affects an incredibly large area and basically just kills everything that can see it, which in a number of tile sets just means that you throw this out and then the mission completes itself in some ways. You do have to be a little particular in certain tile sets because this thing will just bounce around. It won't just stay in one spot cleanly for you, but it does a tremendous amount of damage that scales up the longer it's active, and it's very, very powerful for that. Sleight of Hand, while not normally useful, does have a number of farming applications, such as things like leveling and ESO and such, where, like, you just constantly blow enemies up with this, and that is a very effective means of dealing damage in static areas, so that's quite nice. In addition to that, Hall of Mirrors to go alongside the buffing of Eclipse. This is just a damage buff. Obviously, it's more effective with melee weapons because you get, like, the full 5 multiplier instead of just, like, the 2 that you get with guns. But regardless, like, getting a significant damage increase with any of the weapons that you happen to be using alongside Eclipse, giving you either consistent defense or consistent offense, and whatever you need to be doing, especially while Prism is around, is just a really effective, like, strategy. This is great for farming, like, any number of different things. She just kind of works everywhere, and there are good reasons that even the less powerful version of Eclipse is seeing play on a bunch of other Warframes, because the consistency to do 2 different good things turns out is really good. That's, yeah, A+. I didn't say, I guess, but it obviously. Now, this one previously I talked about as similarly to Mirage and Mesa being an obviously. But it has been years of new thing coming out and Necros working on it, and then a hotfix coming down and Necros no longer working on it. That has happened like clockwork for so many updates, where new resource you want to farm, new arcane you want to farm, new thing you want to farm comes out, and then the farming Warframe, whose only thing he has to his damn name is farming, with Desecrate giving him more drops, doesn't work. And I've been really lenient because he's just like a long-standing staple where you bring Necros to the mission to get more drops. He does that still. But with his not working on, like, anything, I've come to terms with this Warframe is also a D rank Warframe. I am plummeting Necros from A-, where I had him pretty much exclusively because he had survivable enough whatever and looting, all the way down to D. Is that maybe a little harsh? It's possible. But I really think that, like, his kit overall is technically usable. You can summon some shadows who do mediocre business. You can never mind. Don't worry about Soul Punch. You can strip armor and have enemies run away, which is really inconvenient. And you can get more loot sometimes when you usually don't care about it. If you're a newer player, you're going to care more. But, like, when this Warframe is in a squad, generally speaking, they're either loaded up on every survivability mod and just, like, range and Desecrate's on, which is just, like, forcing them to work for Desecrate, or they are the pretty little passenger princess of the mission who's there with Desecrate on, and the rest of the team is just protecting them, and they're there because the loot work, and that is their only purpose in life. This Warframe, like, thematically and, like, as, like, a total design, deserves to be more than that. And I think that the longer that this has gone on, it has actually made me like kind of just dislike looting abilities, because it constantly comes up as an excuse that admittedly I have used for multiple years to rate this Warframe higher than I think it maybe should be. It sucks. It sucks to have this Warframe be this, because like we should have a cool necromancer plus this, but we don't really get that because he has this, which is, I hate that. I hate that, and I hate it more now than I've ever hated it in the past, pretty clearly, because I have tanked his grade tremendously. Should this maybe be a C-? Yeah, maybe. But fuck it, I'm putting him at D for all of the bad grades he hasn't been getting, because he's had his get-out-of-jail-free card of giving me more loot that he wasn't really giving me over the last year or so at the very least. Now, on the other hand, Nezha has entered his death metal arc, and that has been very good for him. That being said, there was definitely like some thoughts like earlier in this year about me lowering Nezha's grade a little bit. That was before the new subsume kind of bumped Nezha right back up to where he was, keeping him at a nice A+. I think the Nezha, especially with the new build, is still incredibly powerful. And with the 4+ flame combination, you can really clear out a ton of enemies very, very quickly. That, of course, combines well with Warding Halo, giving you very solid survivability, though not as solid as it's been in the past. And, of course, the defense down on enemies of Blazing Chakram and, like, your 1 being, like, a moderate buff is all pretty good. You just generally have a lot going for you. I will say that the subsume is a huge part of that, because it really gives you the damage part of your kit just on a whim very easily. But there's also not really a huge reason that you can't like also inflict that either with like your 2 augment or with like, you know, your weapons and such to spread those statuses around. So there's really a few different ways to access that good stuff from Divine Spears even still, though you do need its augment to get in there. But yeah, really good things for Nezha. That new death metal build I really like quite a lot. Nidus. Nidus, unfortunately, is in the case of the poorly aging health and armor only Warframes. So I have moved Nidus down from B just to B-. There's maybe a bit of an argument that he could get moved down into C, but I'm a little like skeptical to do so, as in a lot of content, Nidus still does a slow but consistent job. This mostly revolves around Parasitic Link being a whole lot of damage reduction, so usually you're really not in threat of dying. But the, you know, end strategy of what Nidus is up to being like Virulence, which performs worse now than it kind of ever has in the past because of the increased health of enemies, is not doing amazing. Like, you know, casting like your big, you know, area and getting the maggots and stuff and parasitic linking up to an enemy and larving those enemies and then casting virulence into it. It's a really cool game plan that like works, but the actual effectiveness of this really could be a whole lot better. I think that this is the case of like, number 1, of course, health and armor being like, you know, changed up in some way to help the Warframes that are health and armor only, or just, you know, Warframes that want to survive with health and armor being generally buffed a little bit could really help with these different concerns. But even with that, I do think that that would only really move Nidus back up to like the B rank that he was at previously. And I do think something else has to happen with his kit, whether that's an augment or just like a general like buff pass on like what virulence does perhaps, for him to like really get that much better. Speaking of getting that much better, I last year gave Nova an A-, and apparently that causes like her to be buffed. Just like hit the alarms, everybody like batten down the hatches. Nova's got to be buffed. She's almost falling out of A. She, with her rework, very easily, trivially moves right back up to A+. She was falling a little bit over like the last few years. She went from A+ down to A and then A-, and then the nukes were deployed, and now she's the nuke that was deployed. She is in a much more consistent state at performing at pretty much all levels, whether that is her like antimatter drop nuking enemies, Her Null Star, nuking enemies with its augment, or just like this being like defensively very powerful, speeding around with Wormhole, or now you get to be Spiva and Slova on really any given build, as now you can just Spiva whenever you want. That also still affects enemies that have Overguard on them and everything else. So Nova gets to do what she wants. She will always be buffed, and she's always going to be good, is what I learned, because if she is ever in question of dropping out of A, it seems like she's going to get buffed, which I personally have no problem with. I really like Nova a lot, and it's good to see her at A+. She is absolutely tremendously useful for pretty much everything, and she was only made better at farming by being able to swap from her speed up to her slow down as it suits her. But yeah, really good stuff. Honestly, like the buffs were like fairly unnecessary. I probably still would have put her at A-. But yeah, great stuff. She loves it. Speaking of Warframes that got buffed, let's talk about Nyx a bit. Nyx is kind of in a weird case. First and foremost, let's talk about that she is moved from a B. I have moved her all the way up to a solid A. I will say there is some like contention on my part. I might have wanted to place her at A-, but I am going to put her at A, as it has felt pretty right. The reason she's being put at A is because her rework did a lot to help her out. Not only is Mind Control actually a reasonable build around ability where you can stack up damage on an AI controlled character and have that like enemy actually do work and kill a bunch of enemies, especially depending on how good the enemy is that you mind control. That in and of itself is pretty impressive, but it's the gimmicky thing that you can do with Nyx's kit. Psychic Bolts being a just like defense reduction that removes all shields and all armor from everything as you just continually kill more enemies, and they just spread, and they give you Overguard, and they give you shields, and they just give you is really good. This is just like spreading, just defense removal from pretty much all the enemies you're going to interact with. It's super cheap. It's a one-handed cast. It's really great just for casting at will. It's really great for turning your shields back on if you happen to like want to be out of your 4 and move around quicker. You can pretty much just cast this to shield gate up or steal shields from enemies, and that's all very good. Chaos is of course still just like a general, like, it's mostly like an interception type ability where like this will cause some disruption to the enemies, but it's not going to be the craziest thing in the world. This is mostly, I will say, worth casting because of her new passive, giving you a tremendous amount of critical chance on your primary and secondary weapons. 200% critical chance it's an extra mod basically of the type that you really want on basically all of your weapons. So provided you're using critical benefit weapons, which most weapons are, I would say, you're getting a huge buff from that Chaos can easily enable. Chaos also is usually used with like the rad procs on the mind controlled enemy to make them even stronger, so on and so forth. But this is just like generally good, and it enables your passive really trivially, which is great. And then Absorb. Now Absorb is only used with its augment. I would go so far as to say that I do not know why the unaugmented version of this ability still exists, but we all use it with the augment. And with that, she got a little bit of like some mobility help. And like she's like a little bit faster in this state now. In her like regular state, she can fly around now. If you do want to use it unaugmented, that's like kind of cool, at least. Maybe that's the reason it still exists. But the big thing here is that you are basically doing a Revenant impression. If you just need to be invincible for a thing, this turns on the I'm completely invincible button. It no longer chaotically drains your energy whenever a bunch of enemies shoot machine guns into it, so it's really easy to keep going for very long periods of time. The damage output of this is completely negligible, but like it does technically exist. But being able to just have the no you button and just do what you want, even if you're a little slow, is still really solid. So combined with her like mass, debuffing of all enemies, plus like a mind control that is actually kind of decent, which is crazy, plus her massive buffing for like her just weapons that you're going to get in general. You like replace like usually her 1 if you're going to with like a nourish or something, like weapons platform her up really easily with the crit plus like a nourish buff or what have you. And she can really get to work on pretty much any piece of content really easily. Does she do it a little slowly if you're not jumping around and like doing shield gating things with psychic bolts? Yeah, I would say so. But that's you know, that's conditional. That's like if I'm stealing a bunch of shields and Overguard, I can kind of just go where I want until those shields and Overguard are broken, and then maybe I just like instantly turn Absorb on. But this has no casting time. It just turns on. So it's not like that can't be my response to my shield gate being broken, is that I turn this thing on and have to slow down for half a second, which really is not so big a deal. So I think Nyx is in a really phenomenal spot right now. Okay, let's talk about Oberon. I'll be honest, after actually going through and recording this stuff and talking about Necros and such, I do think that most of the argument around Oberon is that I do have him still at C-, and this is more of a discussion about why he's not at D, I think, maybe. Because I think that I wouldn't have a ton of people disagreeing with me if I just put him at D. But I do think that he's a little bit better than the other D rank Warframes. You still can kind of do some stuff with him. You know, between Renewal and Hallowed Ground, like the healing and armor is still a little something. Smite, like with its augment, is like a damage buff that's okay. Reckoning can strip armor if they're standing on Hallowed Ground, and it is a really tiny AoE. Is this Warframe the absolute bottom of C? Oh yeah, for sure. It's tough out here, and he massively deserves a rework. Actually, I've talked myself in. We're gonna move him down to D. Actually, yeah, no, I can't. No, he's gonna go down to D. You know, we could split. Tell me in the comments. I'm having a tough time. Is he D or C-? What do you think? Because like, I'm gonna put him at D. I'm gonna put him at D because it's like actually very difficult to determine whether or not he should be down in here. We are gonna just bump him down into the pit. Please rework this boy. I don't know if some of that is just that I think that the paladin like satyr like stuff is really cool. Please rework Oberon. He deserves it. He deserves something. Okay, we can stop feeling negatively at all now. It's Octavia. Octavia, you know, for all the time she's existed running, is an A+. Unsurprisingly, she has access to a Korean MMO's worth of buffs on Metronome, one of which includes refreshable invisibility, which as a stock standard is good. Honestly, if she only was Metronome, she wouldn't be an A, but she wouldn't be doing that bad. Just invisibility plus all the other buffs that she can give out are quite nice. And then that is coupled with her one being Mallet, where she can just put down an AoE, enemies shoot it, and then all the enemies fall over dead. This was made even better by the armor changes, because the armor changes only allowing up to 90% DR makes it so the enemies kill themselves more effectively, which is really, really useful and good. Resonator is her worst ability, quote unquote. This like turns off enemy AI and it'll carry Mallet around, but you usually want your Mallet wherever you put it down, so generally you don't cast Resonator and this becomes a free subsume slot. But it is worth noting that Resonator is like not a bad ability. Generally this just makes enemies like incapable of attacking and they just like follow after this thing and like just don't attack, which is as a stock standard pretty decent. But the real star of the show here is that you're invisible, you have all these insane buffs, you're giving all those buffs potentially to your entire team, you're throwing down Mallet, and you're combining it all with Amp. Amp is a large damage bonus for yourself and your entire team based on the amount of noise in the environment, which is pretty much always maxed, especially if you're 3 and your 1 are on. And that is also going to increase the range of your Mallet whenever your 4 and your Mallet are together, meaning that you just have a really large AoE where the enemies shoot the ball and then the ball kills them. You're invisible and can't be interacted with functionally, and have a big damage bonus for the enemies that you do want to shoot. It's just good stuff. It works on like basically everything. There's pretty much like nothing that this doesn't work on. You will have like, you know, some considerations for some more of like the newer enemies. They kind of just blow up when they die, but that's like the most you're dealing with. Octavia is still crazy. Speaking of still crazy, Protea got her prime, and okay, we're gonna get it out of the way. This is my favorite Warframe, but for good reason. Protea is ridiculous. Once again, we are placing her at a very easy A+. She has her one, which just tosses out these blade nades that can kill enemies, the weaker enemies, very easily. This did get a little bit of a knock, similar to things like Catrine, and like all of the enemies, you know, Hydroid and all that stuff, because enemies are less affected by slash than they were. Not that they are actually less affected, but they have, you know, more health now, so it takes longer to kill them with slash procs. But that's not the biggest deal in the world. This is going to clean up a lot of lower level enemies and is actually very good for regular path farming. And at higher levels, the stun that it kicks out is still quite nice, and it is going to be a nice amount of damage that it's doing. And this ability has another half with the shield satellites, where you're going to toss the shield satellites down, and as long as they exist on the floor, they'll just attach to you anytime your shields break, making you functionally invincible for a very long amount of time, especially with the enhanced shield gate invincibility that you get whenever these attach to you. Meaning that it's insanely difficult to kill you as long as you've got some shield satellites that you've been tossing out, which of course you should be. That is then combined with the thing that still works very well at high level, and works even better now with the armor changes, being Blaze Artillery, lowering down that, like, what used to be 99% damage reduction down to 90, plus the armor strip that this still does give, albeit slowly, from the heat procs, means that Blaze Artillery on enemies that are, like, grouped at all or in kind of a line is incredible at just shredding through just any amount of enemies. The more enemies there are, the better this is at just obliterating them all. And notably, in open worlds, this is actually, I think, one of the more useful abilities to be taking, because with a large amount of range built on Protea, you can actually just have this as a functional sniper that is just going to clear out the very large zone objectives that you can be encountering in those situations, which is quite useful. Combine that with Dispensary being infinite health and energy orbs and also ammo restores, though that's, of course, the weakest part of this ability. And you functionally just get a perfect energy economy with Dispensary, where you can toss out Blaze Artilleries and Grenade Fans at will with no stopping, and then whatever subsume you want, because Temporal Anchor is not great. It's not that there's not a build here, especially with the new augment that lets you have like an infinite duration Blaze Artillery type beat with this, but in general, Temporal Anchor is just going to be a thing that you're going to remove and replace with something better. There's a number of different options for this, whether that's like, you know, Roar or Gloom or just any number of things that you can put on this. And all of that is made easier to subsume onto her because her passive is every 4th power cast is granted an additional 100% ability strength, more than a full Blind Rage's worth of strength for whatever subsumed ability you want to put on. Meaning incredibly strong Roars, incredibly high level Glooms, all of that good stuff at a very low build cost to you. So she's just stellar. Again, my favorite Warframe. Maybe she should be an A. But hey, she performs A+ for me in pretty much every content I bring her to. Let's talk about the big radioactive boy. This is Corvex. This is the second time he's been on a roster review, and last time I gave him a B ranking. I will say, last time I was lenient on what Corvex was providing, and he honestly really needed to be buffed whenever we talked about him last. But, you know, maybe I was giving him a little more credit than he deserved, but he was usable enough. That being said, he has remained at the same rank, quote unquote, year over year, staying at a B rank. Now, this B rank is pretty much completely and entirely because of his new augment that basically allows you to play tower defense with his Shrinka pillars, where you put the pillars down in 2 different locations, then you go into his Crucible Blast, and it turns his pillars into Crucible Blasts that are localized to wherever they are, that constantly blow up the enemies that are spawning there, while you shoot lasers at whatever you happen to be seeing, and then you're invincible while you are casting your Crucible Blast. That game plan is narrow, but it does work very well in a number of scenarios, and it's like a pretty decent thing to be doing. Unfortunately, that doesn't help much with Containment Wall being a very lackluster ability that has a damage vulnerability on it and, like, quote-unquote groups enemies, though not very effectively. It pretty much moves the enemies who are already standing in a line into a slightly tighter line in front of you, which I don't particularly see much value in. And then Disymmetric Guard, which is a buff that he gets himself and for the squad, but this, you know, it gives you status effect negation, but it really needs to give you like way more than this. Disometric Guard is a very weak ability, and Corvex would be much better if this gave not only healing whenever you gain charges, because in general his stats reflect that he's more tilted towards being like a health tank, which he doesn't do very well because he has no in-kit way to heal. And then in addition to that, this being some form of damage reduction, again, this is maybe a symptom of health tanking not being very good right now and needing outside buffs, but this having some type of damage reduction would really be needed for Corvex to be more successful in his tanking endeavors that don't involve him just staying in Crucible Blast and being invincible all the time. But being invincible all the time is pretty good. Two of the best Warframes in the game do that. So yeah, put down pillars, blow stuff up, be a big nuclear reactor boy, and it's okay. Now, speaking of being invincible, the poster child for such a thing, Revenant. Now, we all know where this is going, especially if you watched last year's review, and that is that, of course, Revenant is staying at S tier. He has not been nerfed, which is a bit surprising, as I did think that it was probably going to happen. But the thing that Revenant offers is you hit Mesmer Skin, and you are invincible usually for upwards of 20 seconds. At least, because the charges fall off as they are used. That is like the main appeal of Revenant. If you want to do something, you turn on the I can't be really interacted with or like, you know, die at all. And outside of some very, very, very niche scenarios, that pretty much just works across the board. In general, I consider Revenant to be the easiest to use, almost to the point of being like an accessibility mode for Warframe. There are like a number of situations that like I have seen where people that have like, you know, like limited vision or like some other kind of like, you know, thing going on in their life that makes it so they might not otherwise be playing Warframe, but the ease with which they can play Warframe as Revenant makes it so that they are playing Warframe, and I see that as a good thing. In addition to that, this is not disruptive to really any other players. You make yourself invincible, but everything that you do is Revenant, you still have to do. Whether that's like do damage with like Dance Macabre, which like is like not like as good as using weapons, but like technically works. Or if you're using like his Enthrall plus Reeve combo to do percentage damage to instantly kill enemies, that's also a thing that you can utilize. But most people using Revenant, I find, are just on like, you know, Nourish over your 4 or Roar over your 4 or some such like that, and just shoot the enemies to death until they die to death, or use a melee or whatever else. They're just using Revenant as a platform to use whatever cool weapon they want to or like should be using for the content that they're doing. And that like type of like non-disruptive power, I think, is maybe overall a good thing. Is Revenant insanely highly used and extremely powerful and great for basically everything? Yeah. But he is the only S rank we've ever had that I think nerfing him would come with some significant downsides for different parts of the community, and like not really any particular upsides. So yeah, once again, kind of the discussion of like Revenant's the S rank that I almost made an S- for, because I really don't think there's a great reason to nerf him right now. But yeah. Let's talk about Rhino. So Rhino has not changed a whole lot really in terms of like what he's up to. Some of like, you know, the definitions of what he's been doing have changed a bit with his 2 becoming Overguard and all that, some such. But generally what Rhino has been up to lately is Iron Skin, just giving you Overguard and then giving you an invincibility at the end of that, and then Rhino being a Warframe with shields allows you to, anytime your 2 breaks, just turn your 2 back on, and you're usually invincible the entire time of that rotation, kind of no matter how much you're being shot at, because there's also a time invulnerable at the beginning of Iron Skin that also builds up your Overguard, so usually lasts for at least as long as that time invulnerable, meaning that you just tap 2 anytime you're taking damage, and you're kind of just fine. Combine that with Roar, which is arguably the strongest damage buff in the game, with, of course, a lot of Warframes opting to get the nerfed version of this from the subsumes. And you've got an incredibly powerful weapons platform that can also be built to, like, you know, have a hilarious amount of Iron Skin using, like, the Iron Charge builds and such like that. And, of course, Rhino Stomp is, like, a fine ability for crowd control if you do want to be doing that. In general, though, the thing that Rhino's up to is just like, I press 2 real good, I press 3 real good, and then I shoot the enemy real good. And it all kind of comes out to be just a pretty explicitly worse version of what Revenant's up to, which is kind of unfortunate because we just talked about how good the stuff he's doing is. But he also does have those other options, being like his dance and all the other abilities and things that he can apply to missions, whereas Rhino really doesn't have that. I really wish that Rhino Charge and Rhino Stomp were like more effective in like current day Warframe, but they just kind of aren't keeping up with like other things to do on top of like the weapons platforming stuff that Rhino does so well. So we have kept Rhino at the B+ that he has kind of just been at. But of course, he is still tremendously good. And if you are a new player, I would really suggest that you get him, as he is tremendously powerful for new players, especially with his, like, you know, basically nothing that you can build him on and make him very effective. Time to talk Saren. So, like all the other Warframes that on all of the past ratings have been an A+, and it has been unshocking to all of those involved. Yeah, guess what? Not much has changed for Saren. Yeah, there it is. She's the A+. Once again, surprising absolutely nobody. Saren can be built in a variety of ways, whether that is the gardening style of spores, killing everything on the map at a medium pace as they build up. Whether that is utilizing Toxic Lash plus like her 1 augment to tremendously buff your weapons and deal immense amounts of damage that way. Whether that's like, you know, just like hitting enemies with the viral on miasma to like wipe them out after spores. Whether you're just like speeding through missions with Molt, which I have seen people do, or whether you're replacing her Molt with Gloom and doing like a hilarious tank build that actually works on her because Gloom plus spores means that you're constantly healing for your full health total. Pretty much whatever you decide to do as Saren, it's pretty much going to work out for you. And that hasn't changed. She is tremendously powerful in a myriad of ways, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Speaking of tremendously powerful, this one comes with a few caveats. We, of course, have Sevagoth Prime now, and with that, we have a heavily augmented Sevagoth build that entirely forgoes the Shadow. This, of course, lowers the cost of the build for Sevagoth quite a bit, but also gives you a unique power in that you can cast your Reap plus your Sow plus specifically Roar as your Subsume over your 4. And that gives you the capability to instantly deal percentage damage, 100% of the enemy's health as damage to them in a radius that keeps exploding and spreading as the enemies die from it. That's pretty good. Watching it in effect is like insane. Like, just watch it go off and just popcorn through a map and just kill everybody, and watch the ghosts just come out of the enemies that are dying and create more enemies that are dying in the chain. And it is an immensely powerful way to play Sevagoth. It is not his Shadow, unfortunately, for a lot of people that really like the Shadow. But it is an incredibly powerful playstyle that I think does deserve Sevagoth being bumped up all the way up to A. It's really powerful for a number of different farms that you can do, and just like it's incredibly safe in the vast majority of situations as well. I will say that like the safety of it and the consistency with which you're not going to die while doing it does get him bumped down from what could be an A+ down to just an A. As it is a bit more on like the dangerous side of the playstyle, as it's not quite like Korra where you're always casting your 1, otherwise what are you doing? You do have to like very like specifically cast his abilities and in smart ways to really get the best performance out of it. But you can, you know, cast your 1 a bunch if you need to shield gate up, but the energy economy can maybe be a little hitchy depending on what your setup is. And there's just a few little things here and there that I think bump him just a little bit out of an A+ territory. But the current build for Sevagoth, Red Mage Sevagoth, is going absolutely crazy and has no real signs of slowing down. Speaking of no real signs of slowing down, ever since Styanax got his augment, he has been one of the best supports, if you can really call him that, in the game. Maintaining his A+ ranking, Styanax is currently tremendously powerful. Of course, he has a full defense strip and a heal on his Theros Strike, which is nice, but the main seller here is Rally Point, giving you a massive amount of energy regeneration for yourself and your entire squad, and getting regenerating shields on every kill is tremendously good for your survivability as a baseline. Combine that with your 4 plus its augment on any hit you deal to an enemy with this ability, you and your entire squad get overguard for every hit, means that you're effectively just completely invincible all of the time. This all scales with being able to subsume on stuff like Nourish, which will not only increase the amount of energy that you're kicking out, but also Nourish affects the damage of Final Stand, which just means you have like a tremendously, like, well, at least very reasonably powerful fourth ability to be dealing damage with while maintaining the invincibility and energy regeneration of your entire team pretty much completely passively. Stynex, a phenomenal support, maybe not what you'd expect to say whenever you look at him, but definitely performing as one. Okay, another newbie to the list, we have Temple. Now, Temple is an interesting one because I'm not so certain that they are currently working how they're supposed to. And what I mean by that is that they use pyrotechnics, which like builds up their meter, and they have like their tempo that they use that to get like the additional damage and all that. And they have overdrive, which is going to give you like the crit stats and everything. And they have Ripper's Wail, which allows you to build up a heat damage as you use your other abilities well. And also this gives you the ability to regenerate your shields and be invincible while you're doing it. And then, of course, you have Exalted Solo, which lets you use Lizzie in order to basically have an Exalted Flamethrower, an Exalted Ignis, really, that is quite effective at dealing damage. That all being said, right now, things are a bit weird, as you would think that Ripper's Wail would scale your heat procs and also like scale up the damage of both Overdrive and Pyrotechnics, and it did scale over Pyrotechnics for a moment there, but now it doesn't. And it also currently doesn't scale any of your heat procs appropriately that you're going to be getting out of Exalted Solo or really anything else. Even though like the damage that gets added up to 750% is tremendous without that multiplier, it really is a bit on like the lackluster side, even though it definitely should be giving you that multiplier. It's in a little bit of a weird state. I think if things were working more consistently across Temple's kit, I could probably pretty easily give them a B+, but with the way things are currently, I do think I have to just sit at a B for them. They perform well. Like they just, flamethrower about, and that this buff does still give the upfront damage to those heat procs. It just, or not the procs, to the actual damage that you're dealing. But it is a bit of a weird one with like just the way pyrotechnics and overdrive generally perform, that I think it makes more sense currently for Temple to just be at a B, which is, again, not bad. It's time to talk Titania. Titania is simultaneously, I would say, maybe the highest effort Warframe and also the lowest. Obviously famous for her Firefly build, where you put Thermal Sunder over one of her abilities, go into her 4, and go incredibly fast through the mission, utilizing her 4's augment, the ability just to cast Thermal Sunder while you're in that, spamming out flame AoEs to just burn the entire mission to the ground. That is generally done on regular path, where you can just speed through pretty much any mission utilizing that strategy. This is incredibly good for farming any new Prime access. This is incredibly good for popping relics on fast missions like Captures and Exterminates. And all of those things are incredibly relevant to just those farms that are going to come up pretty much every 3 months that pass. There's going to be a new PA, a new time where Titania is going to be immensely useful. And if you are a newer player and you don't just have every single Prime item like I do, incredibly useful for farming all of that stuff that you will still need to farm. She is the by far best at it, and only asks that you get good at controlling her 4, which can be a tall ask. In addition, she was recently made better, as the guns in her Razor Wing are now much, much stronger due to getting the Exalted buffs, but her sword wasn't so well adjusted to the new Exalted things. That weapon has never been good, and it looks like that's not going to change anytime soon. But for her actual guns, they do perform a bit better now, and they kind of hold up more in Steel Path than they have ever in the past. In addition to that, she does now give buffs with her little razor flies that go around. They'll give you an increase to your damage. So she's just kind of generally a bit better in Steel Path than she ever has been. That being said, I've been giving Titania a consistent A+. And the improvements to her exalted weapon, though I would say on the more minor side, and just like to, generally what she's doing being a little bit better overall. She's going to remain easily, I think, at an A+ for just being the best at a variety of farms and just being generally pretty good at kind of whatever you want to bring her to with her unique stuff that she can apply. But yeah, it's like, I mean, what do you want? She's the most efficient thing as long as you can get good. And that gives her an easy A+, being so good at so many things. Let's have a disappointing conversation about Trinity. Now, Trinity, last year, before her rework, was at a B ranking. And now, post-rework, she is at a B ranking. This is another case of, I do think that Trinity's rank was going to go down without the changes that she got, but the changes that she got basically make it much more convenient to heal the squad and yourself with Blessing, and utilizing Link, and, like doing energy vampire things like you've been able to. Well of Life is an ability you can cast, and like is, kind of almost interesting with the kind of combinations you could theoretically do with energy vampire. And Well of Life is actually mostly interesting as a subsume on some other weird scenarios, but energy vampire is the one that could like almost combine with like Marked for Death to like almost make a DPS thing, but it doesn't work quite as well due to some interactions with the way the Link works and a bunch of weird things with Trinity that could get hammered out. But the basic gist of what the rework did for Trinity is it makes her still the same amount of good at being invincible between Link and Blessing and giving the buffs of Blessing to your squad, and providing energy whenever you can, which is usually way more energy than anyone needs. Not that that's a problem, but she's just rooting around, shooting gun, and doing a thing. It's just entirely fine. She is very similar to Harrow, like totally capable, but just like not poor performer, not amazing, just good stuff. There's no reason you can't play Trinity, but it's not going to be a particularly special time. Let's talk about Valkyrie. Now, as of this video, we're in a little bit of a weird place because this is just before the Valkyrie rework hits. I am in a very lucky position, and I very much appreciate this, that I have already played an early version of the Valkyrie rework, as she's going to be changed to no longer be invincible in her 4, and have some like significant changes to her kit just in general. That being said, having played her rework early, even with the further changes they've announced since then that they responded to feedback, I have opted on this tier list to keep her at the exact same rank. She was previously just at a B rank, and I actually, for most content, don't see that changing. For much higher end content, like level capping stuff in Cascade and things that you could theoretically do with Valkyrie in the past, which she was a semi-niche pick for, but could do it, I think she's going to be much, much worse. But for general play, for like newer players and regular content and EDA and ETA and all of those types of places in content, I think that she is going to be a better designed, similar performer to what she has been doing. So it kind of puts it in a weird spot. She's losing a niche that is not particularly important because there's other Warframes that fill that niche better already before this change. And I do think that her design is going to get better, but I don't think that she is going to get better with those changes. That's obviously going to be a bit disappointing to a lot of people, but I do foresee that Valkyrie will see play one way or another in the future for one reason or another. And speaking of consistent performance, Vauban. Vauban has kind of just been in one type of way for a little while here. He's like moved around in C rank to various spots in it. And he's not moving this year. He's just at a C rank. There are interesting things to do with Vauban. He's got like a slew of abilities, but unfortunately, generally speaking, they're rather ineffectual. Tesla Nervos has a cool augment, which like deals damage in some interesting ways. It's slow and just not very good. His 2, of course, has the like Flechette Orb that can scale up. This is going to be the primary thing you're going to be doing if you're really going to want to use his like abilities to DPS. Then he's got a bunch of other functionalities that are just like not particularly good. Overdriver probably being the second best one, which is not stellar because Vector Pad and Tether Coil are pretty much doing nothing. His Photon Strike, which while extremely cool, this is a giant beam from space that does absolutely fuck all, and like has piss poor damage, with people coping insanely hard using like just hilarious scenarios to make this thing look like it does any kind of reasonable amount of damage. Both its radius and damage dealt, even though it does technically scale with level, is just sad. And even throwing like multiple of these into your vortex feels pretty bad. Speaking of Bastille/Vortex, generally the only thing on here that's used is pretty much always going to be Vortex. It's crazy to me that like the debuffing of armor and such does not work while this is vortexing and only works during the bestilling. In general, it's just like it's not great all the way around. You can make Vauban work. Generally, that's going to be done through like using Nourish to scale Flechette Orbs, because yes, that does work. Flechette Orbs scale with level, and then you just like vortex enemies up and let the Flechette Orbs kill the enemies. And that's like okay as long as you keep yourself safe with like usually just shield gating and stuff. It's like a thing to do. It is a unique playstyle for sure. I wish everything about it was better than it is. Especially Photon Strike. This was a brand new ability that they added onto Vauban, and it has never once been good, even though it is a relatively recent addition. Vauban deserves to be better than this. That could be my bias, as the Warframe that I would argue shares a theme with him, Protea, is my literal favorite Warframe. But, you know, it is what it is. He's okay. On a much more positive note, let's talk Volt. So, interestingly, much like both of the other starters, I had Volt at a B+, and I think things have evolved to the point where I can easily give Volt an A- as well, bringing all of our starter Warframes up into the A category. This is for a variety of reasons. Volt, interestingly, has very similar applications to Titania. Not in that, like, doing exterminates or captures like as fast as Titania on like regular path to farm relics and like do those particular farms, but more in that Volt brings a particular melee style power to doing missions quickly in Steel Path level content, where you can use Shock with Shock Trooper, combine that with a melee influence melee weapon, combined with speed to increase your attack speed very tremendously, and then of course just like running through the mission usually with like some buff like Nourish or what have you over Discharge, and then being able to like use your electric shield where needed, whether that's a defense objective or whether you just want to be holding it for the buff that it can give for your guns, which can also combine with Shock Trooper to be quite effective. You just generally do pretty good stuff. It is like a very solid thing here. Melee getting a whole lot better is a whole lot of the reason that Volt has moved up a bit here, as I think without melee influence, it would be a much harder sell. But with melee influence, I think it's a pretty easy sell here to put Volt up to the A- category, which is good to see. Good to see all of the starters moving on up, and Volt didn't even need an Exalted rework to get there. Speaking of moving on up, we have Varuna. Varuna, as of the last tier list, was at a B-, which is tough. And I really like Varuna, so it was tough to see. But thankfully, some madman at DE decided to just design an augment, Prey of Dinar, that is just every single conceivable word that is functionally a rework that you could install on Varuna. That augment allows you to use your one Shroud of Dinar, mark an enemy who will glow your energy color, and then you just use your 2 on them, and then if they die, usually they die from the statuses that you're putting on them, but there is a little bit of a gamble with that. It spreads to a tremendous 50-meter area when modded, through walls, which used to be 100, but that got nerfed down to a reasonable level, 50, which is still incredibly good. That spreads to every enemy in that radius, and then your 1 will mark another guy for you to also hit your 2 on, and then spread all those statuses to everybody again. This does involve, again, a little bit of gamble with getting the damaging statuses, but it is a tremendously unique, fun, and most importantly, good playstyle, as you also have Lyceth's Hunt to use whatever melee weapon, usually like a heavy slam melee weapon, in order to use Lyceth's Hunt to generate a bunch of energy. And Lyceth's Hunt effectively lasts infinite duration because Fangs of Rosh meets the requirements for Lyceth's Hunt to have its duration increased. This does, unfortunately, mean that usually you're getting rid of Ulfrin's Descent, because you're using your 2 to kill all these enemies, and not your 4. Your 4 is on the lackluster side, and even with its augment, I think that it drastically underperforms. This is pretty much always, I would say, replaced by Roar or a different damage buff. If you want to make your energy economy even better for some reason, you could go with Nourish, but I would pretty much just say this is always going to be Roar instead to buff up the rest of your game plan. But that new game plan, maybe a little overzealously by me, I want to point out, I did mull over whether this should be an A-, but I am going to put Varuna at just a solid A. Part of that is that you also tend to not really have problems whenever the enemies aren't dying to the Fangs of Rosh stuff, because just spam casting Shroud of Dinar with its massive like melee buffs and like the slam weapon you usually have on Varuna is more than good enough for almost all content, just to like slam through with those tremendous buffs, constantly re-upping your shield gate with Shroud of Dinar. And while that is a bit of an energy spend while you're doing it, like its hunt is filling you back up as you kill enemies, so it's usually not really a big problem to be doing that whenever that is the solution that you have to kind of resort to. So because of those like lack of problems that I've really experienced while playing Varuna, I did decide to just give her the solid A rating. Moving on. Now, this is one that I do worry that people are going to be mad about, but it is what it is. We're talking about Wisp. Now, Wisp, for her entire existence, has been at an A+. She has been very, very good, but the direction things have been going, I think there is a slight downturn for what Wisp is up to, and unfortunately, her most recent augment couldn't really stop this from happening, moving Wisp down from an A+ just to an A, which is, of course, still tremendously good. Wisp is a phenomenal support, but I do think that she pales specifically in comparison to Warframes like Styanax and Dante and her ability to support the team, which is kind of a crazy thing to say, I know. Her 1 gives a bunch of great buffs. The speed buff and the health buff, though the health buff is less good than it has been with those rising levels of enemies, making health tanking much, much worse as we go forward in time. Her 2 being just invisibility, if you need it, and a teleport. The teleport, though, doesn't really matter as much as the invisibility does. Breach Surge being a massive damage multiplier, a great spread ability, an immensely powerful debuff that, of course, we use on Mag, and you're going to see on Deghath in the new build video that she will be getting whenever that comes out. And Soulgate is, with its augment, a workable damage output ability. Even without the augment, you can force it to work, though Breach Surge will be doing the very heavy lifting on that one. But just as a very passive, easy-to-use support that, anytime you're jumping, you're invisible, and that effectively means that you jump to be invincible in the vast majority of cases, plus the generalized, good speed buff that you're giving out, and, of course, the healing and vitality at most levels of play is more than enough for all the survivability your squad could want. And Breach Surge being really powerful is enough to have her be a very, very solid performer at A. And of course, her 4th ability not usually being used usually gives you room to subsume over whatever other incredible bonus you want to put on here, whether that's Roar or Nourish or whatever else to help out your team even more. And that makes her still incredibly good, but I think just shy of A+ tier. This is much more of a top of regular A, as counter to the kind of bottom of regular A maybe that we talked about with Varuna. Time to talk about Danky Kang. Let's talk about Wukong. Wukong has waxed and waned a little bit over the last few years, and right now we are waxing. The Wukong is moved back up to A+ very easily, with the kind of reapplication of Primal Fury being a real weapon for you to use. This is a tremendously powerful 1.0 follow-through influence weapon that has a tremendously good range. Spin attacking with this is an incredibly fast way to clear missions, being honestly pretty comparable with Volt speeding through missions, especially whenever you're combining it with Cloudwalker being used in certain sections. Cloudwalker being incredible for all kinds of spy missions, speedrunning through exterminate missions, going through captures, doing, well, not so much exterminates. Exterminates, you're actually usually going to be spinning with Primal Fury as opposed to casting this whole time. But for capture missions and all those types of really quick missions, really, really powerful. With the correct weapon loadouts, Celestial Twin is still incredibly good as a nice benefit to you on the battlefield. And Celestial Twin also gets a copy of Primal Fury, which, because that is so much better now, is a lot more compelling as well. And yeah, like basically the gist is that Wukong moved from A+ down to an A whenever he got nerfed, and now his 4 is back, so we're back to A+, baby. And there's not really much more to be said than that. He you know, the give and take here. They take and then they give, and then I don't know what we're gonna get taken away next, but let's hope it's nothing. Unfortunately, speaking of the take, though, let's talk about Zaku. Now, Zaku previously was at an A+, but much like a few others that we've talked about on this list, like Hydroid and Catrine, Zaku was made less powerful by the armor changes. The big thing about Zaku was that you could use gaze, set up gaze targets, and then all of the defenses in a gigantic area would be removed, and then your 2 would shoot the enemy and they would be dead. That is less effective now by a pretty considerable margin, because enemies have so much more health now instead of just having all of that armor that you're removing for their total EHP to end up much higher than it would in the past. This was not coupled with like a buff to how much damage the Grasp of Loke does or how much it scales to, and because of that, things are just a bit less effective in general for Zaku. That game plan still totally functions, and Zaku's still at an A, let's not be crazy here. And of course, being the best box breaker and farmer for like a number of different, you know, box breaking things, whether you're doing that on the Zaramon or wherever else, you know, gives you a good niche to go into. But the general game plan of like Grasp of Loke plus gaze and like locking down areas and having your auto turrets just like be shooting the enemies and taking them down still totally works. You'll need to back them up a little bit more with your own weapons now. But it's still a like totally good play style, and like the niche scenarios that come up for Zaku to be very useful, I think still keep them up in A. This is, I will say, another one though where I did consider dropping down to A-, but I think that just A is good at least for now. It's time to talk about our newest Prime, Ureli Prime. Ureli, now I've been saying this for at least since like the last review, and that is that Ureli is pretty good. I've got Ureli still at a B+. I will say I did consider that Ureli maybe should actually be at an A-, but ended up not doing it because I do think there are a few like issues that she'll run into here and there, though they are pretty infrequent. So if you like wanted to argue for her to be at A-, I do think there is a reasonable argument there, but for now I have just kept her at a B+, and we'll kind of see as her prime ages a bit, like where she maybe starts performing over time. But the main draw here is that Marulina is now optional with its augment. With the augment, you can just have Marulina summoned out, and Marulina will spit out sea snares and sea snare the enemies. This combines multiplicatively with the damage vulnerability of your sea snares, meaning there is a tremendous amount of damage on offer whenever you use that augment, in addition to you not having Decay Drive around, which I know for most of us is really the main selling point. That is a tremendous amount of damage just to have right off the bat. In addition to that, Riptide is a very good grouping ability, which can help you utilize the massive critical chance buff of your secondary while you're moving in order to have a ton of damage vulnerability go out, group the enemies up, and then just murder them all. The thing that this doesn't go well with is Aqua Blades. Aqua Blades, I'm sorry to report that even with the augment, which does rely on slash damage, is really only a thing you can technically use as opposed to being something you would ever want to use. This is pretty much just the subsume slot that you should fill with something, and I am not going to lie, that is a large part, I think, of why I did decide to keep her in B+, because Aqua Blades is really just kind of not an ability. It's not an ability at all without its augment, and even with its augment, it is kind of a poor imitation of a DPS ability in the vast majority of cases. But the rest of what Ureli is doing, like, you know, if you like K-Drives, I think Ureli is an easy A for anyone that likes the K-Drives and just, like, wants to do that stuff. And, like, the benefits of being able to cast and recast Marulina to be invulnerable for 4 seconds at a time per the energy you spend lets you be able to, in, like, you know, itchy situations, do a Revenant impression, where you can just, like, keep recasting Marolina and just survive whatever it happens to be that is giving you trouble. But there are a lot of like little positives around on Irelia, and I think the biggest negative is that people really hate the K drives. But the augment, it does help with that if you're willing to go get it. And finally, for the last Warframe on the full 2025 roster review, we get to once again tell everyone how completely fucking underrated Zephyr is. Zephyr is absolutely incredible. I'm putting her at A+ again. I know you people will not play this bird no matter what. I have been saying it. I've been screaming it from the rooftops on stream. No matter what they do, they couldn't really realistically give Zephyr anything else. She already has Turbulence, which is effective invulnerability to almost everything in the game, especially if you're going to subsume silence over one of her abilities. Airburst, which is an incredible grouping ability. It's a great farming ability. It breaks boxes. It's amazing. Tailwind, which is incredibly good for speeding through missions. It's a really like reasonable replace slot. It lets you like activate her passive, which gives her a bunch of damage, a bunch of critical hit chance, but that translates to damage. Really easily if you want to just like float around. Obviously it's like a soft flight because it's that old version, not like the new stuff that Jade has. But then you also have tornadoes. Tornadoes being much more controllable now allows you to do like quadratic ridiculous scaling to enemies and even blast through some forms of attenuation with how much ridiculous scaling you can give this with like the multi-hit modifiers and like doing like Sampotes bullshit to enemies. She's incredible. Absolutely phenomenal. It don't matter. None of you are gonna play her anyway. I've been seeing her play rate every year since her rework, and it's really not going up that much, and I don't think she's ever in danger of getting nerfed. Honestly, the only thing that could possibly get anyone to play this Warframe at this point is, I think, an heirloom skin with a fat ass and huge knockers, and nothing short of that is gonna make people play the bird. And that's just the way that it is. And I can say that because this is the end of the video, and most of you didn't even make it this far. So, yeah, that's gonna do it for the full 2025 roster review. That's where we're at. Go check out brozime.com. Thank you very much to all of those of you on Patreon that have been supporting the site. There's going to be a lot more with that going forward here as we get into the new player experience that we're going to be getting on the new update that we have coming along shortly. And I hope to see you all across this year as it's looking to be a very good TennoCon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. So ends today's video. Thanks so much to all of the patrons for supporting not only this channel, but also the new Soulframe Scholar channel. It is much appreciated as that channel gets started. And thanks very much to our $10 patrons, Atheon, Ith, Hildren Drake, Alex Parnham, Arbiter Daydream, Babyhoot, Arcus, Nuven, Plotomatic, Brutus Salazar, Canolathra, Bob World, Colleen Smith, Dylan Dworsky, Athrain, James Hawthorne, GC4 Science, Josh, Lord Ian, Luzanth, Mike Kiesman, Mikkel, Mitchta, Nerve, Ruby, S267, Sanyu, Cezon, Sharp247, The Coupon of Death, Waifu Wars, Waldado1, Seraphir, and Zero Weebs Plan, and of course all of the $5 and $2 patrons as well. Your support is very much appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.